All right, ladies and gentlemen, where do we start? Well, I'll just start you with my thought process, which you're receiving it if you're listening to the podcast every day. But I think that in America, there is definitely an awakening happening regarding a lot of topics: feminism, big pharma, and definitively foreign policy. It feels like Americans are descending out of a long fog. And when I think about where that fog started in terms of me, so this is obviously anecdotal, but I think anybody that's my age would agree, it definitely began with 9/11. And I had 9/11 on my mind. I have this separate podcast with the Daily Wire Plus called A Shot in the Dark. And I was talking about the birth control industry on this particular episode. And I was pulling some clips, some words from Thomas Sowell that he wrote in one of his books regarding how the feminist movement became successful. And he talked about this process of brainwash that takes place with the spawn of the Department of Education and how they're able to accomplish that brainwash when they have this seated audience of students in the public school system. What are the ideas that we want them to think for the future? It's a tremendous opportunity. Again, to be clear, he was talking about birth control. He was talking about sex education, this idea that we needed to sort of revolutionize our bodies. And I'm reading this to you guys from my iPhone. It's going to be a super casual conversation we're about to have. But he started highlighting the brainwashing methods that have been used in classrooms along the world. And he lists these as psychological conditioning methods that have been used by totalitarian regimes all across the world. Number one, emotional stress, shock, or desensitization to break down both intellectual and emotional resistance. Number two, isolation, whether physical or emotional, from familiar sources of emotional support. Number three, cross-examining pre-existing values, often by manipulating peer pressure. And number four, stripping the individual of normal defenses. And number five, rewarding the acceptance of new attitudes. And so he gave an example of how this could happen if you show someone someone giving birth. It's traumatizing for a kid that's in school to see like a baby coming out of a vagina, especially a kid during that time. Most Americans were graduating with their virginity. They had never had sex. So you're exposing them to sex plus birth at the same time when they're not thinking about it. That is a traumatizing experience. I'm relating this to 9/11 because I just remember this experience so clearly, how shocking it was. I remember us for months and months standing up, the moment of silence, rewatching that footage of the tower, everyone just kind of coming together as Americans to recognize, what had gone on, this act of terrorism. Obviously, I was in 7th grade. I didn't know anything really about terrorism. I hadn't even taken geography class. If you're like me, you got geography started in the 7th grade, didn't know where Saudi Arabia was, where Iraq was, but I understood from the sentiments and the shock of what had happened that no matter what we did next, it was okay. It was okay. That's what I needed to know and learn and be brainwashed about when it came to foreign policy. So fast forwarding to today, obviously, Ukraine gets invaded, and I'm asking some basic questions on my Twitter feed about NATO. Nobody in the media is talking about NATO expanding because you're not allowed to. It's the same emotional thing. Oh my gosh, Ukrainians are dying. Ukrainian children are dying. How on earth could you talk about anything else? The NATO conversation is not relevant. No, it's incredibly relevant. And I saw a clip circulating of somebody named Dave Smith. That name really stands out, right? Dave Smith. What were your parents? And we'll get to that. And I want to show you guys this clip right now.
There's a lot of really wise people within the government who were completely against NATO expansion in the 90s when it first started. At least 3 secretaries of defense, Robert McNamara, Robert Gates, George W. Bush and Barack Obama's Secretary of Defense, William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Defense at the time, they all opposed it in the strongest possible language, and all explicitly for the reason that this will provoke a conflict with Russia. And they were George Kennan, who was the founder of the containment strategy, the old school Cold Warrior. There's this great interview he gave with Thomas Friedman from the New York Times. You can find it online. And it's in the 90s when they're doing the first round of NATO expansion. And he is furious. His anger comes through the page when you're reading it. Because he's like, what are you guys doing? We won the Cold War. We won. And now you're picking a fight with Russia, and this isn't Vladimir Putin's Russia. This was Boris Yeltsin, you know? And he's like, these aren't the Soviets. These aren't the communists. These are the heroes who overthrew them. Why are we picking a fight with them? And he was a cold warrior. He was like, you're throwing away my life's work. And he said, and this was a really, you know, a crazy prediction, really ominous. He said, the people who are advocating expanding NATO are going to continue advocating expanding it and expanding it and expanding it. And then there will be a Russian reaction. And then when there's the Russian reaction, they're going to say, see, that's proof that we have to keep expanding it.
Dave Smith, welcome to the Candace Owens Show.
It's great to be here. Thank you for having me. I thought that guy made some excellent points.
Dave Smith, man, that name, really hard to make a name for yourself, and somehow you did it.
Yeah, no, I gotta just keep saying really wild things so it distracts from my simple, boring name.
So tell my audiences, in case they have not been introduced to you, who you are, where you came from, and how you were having this conversation. That clip is from the Joe Rogan Experience. Is it still being called the Joe Rogan Experience?
It sure is.
Okay. Tell us about you.
I'm Dave. I'm a stand-up comedian. I've been doing stand-up comedy for about 15 years, and I'm based out of New York City. That's where I'm from, but I moved. So that's just what I do is I do stand-up comedy. And I in 2008, I found the Ron Paul campaign when he was running for president. And all of these issues of foreign policy were like central to his campaign. And it was just kind of fascinating to me at the time, if you could think there's like George W. Bush administration, the last year of his administration, the idea that there was a guy with an R and Texas next to his name who was making this argument that we should be non-interventionist and that there's a reason why we're hated throughout so much of the world. And it's actually because we've started all these unnecessary wars and killed a lot of innocent people. And it was almost like, to me, it was kind of, it was almost like a portal to kind of break this weird barrier of just looking at things from inside the perspective of the American empire to looking at things from outside the perspective of the American empire, which is really all I'm talking about in that clip there. It's just like, hey, look, I'm not saying Putin's a good guy or he was right to invade, but let's just look at this from his perspective. What is his grievance here? And if you do that, you'll kind of figure out, if you're being honest, that, oh, he had a bunch of really legitimate grievances. Not to say that's okay that he invaded, Ukraine. In the same way you realize Osama bin Laden had some really legitimate grievances against the United States. That doesn't mean it's okay that he did 9/11. But anyway, so I became a libertarian and just became obsessed with all of this stuff, and then became friends with Joe Rogan. He was a good guy to have as a friend.
I think that's a pretty powerful guy to have as a friend.
Yeah,
for sure
is.
Yeah, so I think what you're describing there, by the way, is this psychological element, and that's why I hint to that point that Thomas Sowell make about isolationist, where it's funny because if you develop this foreign policy idea that we shouldn't be intervening everywhere, they accuse you of being an isolationist, but actually they're mental isolationists. They don't want you to know what is going on outside of your own borders. They want you to be called a traitor if you even want to discuss it or ask any questions meaningfully.
Right.
And then if you start asking questions, one of their routine tricks is dismiss you as stupid. You're not a foreign policy advisor. You've got no history. Do you even have a college degree? You can't ask these sorts of questions. And that is why they did not like it when immediately after Russia invaded Ukraine, I shared speeches leading up to the invasion and after. Vladimir Putin was saying over and over again that this is because NATO is attempting to expand, despite the fact that we were provided assurances following the fall of the Berlin Wall. Nobody in the media will report on that. Why?
Well, look, I mean, because they're trying to sell a war. And it's good for everybody. It's good for business all around. Like if the corporate press, it's good for their ratings. It's good for weapons companies who happen to all, much like the pharmaceutical companies, for whatever reason, Meet the Press brought to you by Boeing. I don't know exactly if Meet the Press's audience is really in the market for anything Boeing's making, but they seem to be cutting them a lot of checks. The truth is that And the whole story of Thomas Sowell was that Thomas Sowell was a leftist Marxist and then got a job in the Department of Labor for like 2 years. And he was just like, oh my God, this is totally unworkable. And he started, his story, it's a really fascinating story, is he started telling them about how he's like, well, look, these people, because he had studied under Milton Friedman. And he was like, well, look, there's this argument that's saying that actually raising the minimum wage is hurting poor people because it's like a hurdle they have to jump over. It's not lifting them up. It's that now they're unemployable if they're not worth that. And he realized very quickly that no one there cared about that. It's like they're not even having the argument. They're like, how do we just expand our department? It doesn't. And so anyway, with the military-industrial complex, it's the worst of all of it because it's all the typical, horrific incentives of government programs, but it's a mass murder campaign. On top of that, it's like the worst government program of all of them. And of course, people are making hundreds of billions of dollars off of all of these wars. So you may, and when you talked earlier about people waking up to, what's going on with these wars, I mean, a large part of that is that the terror wars over the last 20 years have just been nothing but a disaster. Nobody can even defend them. I got blocked on Twitter by John Podhoretz.
I saw that. What an idiot that guy was.
Well, it just started because he called, and I've met him once before. We did a Fox News show together. But if anyone doesn't know, he works at Commentary Magazine. He is the son of Norman Podhoretz, who is like one of the godfathers of neoconservatism, one of the most influential figures. And they just support every single war. And it has something to do with
the war. I like it.
And it has something to do with the fact that they're very pro-Israel. I mean, there's a connection there. And this is something I think people need to be aware of.
I just want to say, Dave Smith is Jewish.
Yeah, sure am.
It's very important. Actually, let's just rinse ourselves before you talk further about that. We condemn terrorism. We obviously do not support terrorism anywhere in the world. I condemn racism in all its forms. I condemn sexism in all its forms. I condemn anti-Semitism in all its forms.
There you go. It's right. And look, this from like being a Jewish guy who's critical of Israel. It's like being a black conservative. It's like, it's not even what you're first met with isn't even a counter argument. It's just some exercise in social psychology to like shame. Oh, so you hate black people. You hate yourself. I guess you hate your mom and your family or whatever. It's all just so stupid, but it is enough to get most people to not want to touch it because most people aren't like me and you know what I mean? Who are just kind of built for this type of war. But most people are like, I don't want to be called these horrible things. And so it's effective. But anyway, so Podhoretz, he called Thomas Massie anti-Semitic filth. I mean, it's like, what a strong term to call somebody. He called him anti-Semitic filth because, and I'm not exaggerating, because Thomas Massie made the point that we are broke. We're $30+ trillion in debt, and this is insane that we're borrowing money to fund every war around the world. And he called him anti-Semitic filth. And I literally just asked him, I said, hey, of all of these wars that you've supported, because he supported the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen. In fact, in Syria, he was critical of Obama for not doing more. And I go, so which one of them worked out? Which one was the last war that you supported that worked out? And he blocked me because there's no answer to that. He's not going to even tell his own audience that any one of those wars I just mentioned was a success. But yet the same people who championed every single one of them are championing the next war. And it's kind of like, hey, what's going on here?
Yeah, these are the kind of arguments that I used to get into with Meghan McCain. McCain, obviously, there's a reason that you guys support every war. This is how you're able to fund your lifestyle. It's your only entry into discussion at all as the daughter of somebody who hasn't actually done anything successful herself other than be somebody's daughter. But it's the same thing. They speak down to us like we're stupid because they see themselves as a part of this like protected academic elite. And your perspectives is this, your perspective is that. And I'm like, you've been wrong every single time. What grants you the arrogance to say that us saying, after trillions of dollars spent, after making enemies literally everywhere, and by the way, you say this is about global security, we don't even have national security.
Right.
So you can miss me with your global security debate. We are not more secure globally, and we have definitively disintegrated as a country, as a nation, in terms of national security. Our borders are wide open, and you're calling Thomas Massie anti-Semitic filth for not agreeing, not to, by the way, be clear, he wasn't asked, he didn't even discuss not sending the mandatory billions of dollars that we send Israel every year. He was talking about the additional,
Right.
what was it, 22 billion, whatever it was, 22 billion. He said, sorry, we literally can't afford to do this. He has been consistent on this point, no matter who it is, no matter what nation it is. But again, a psychological aspect here to say that if you say something that makes sense, we're going to call you anti-Semitic. And do you want to wear that label on you? Well, then you better get in line. That's psychology,
Yeah.
not rationality.
No, that's absolutely right. And, of course, Thomas Massie was also the guy who stood up in 2020 when those gigantic spending bills were being proposed. And he was the only one saying, like, hey, can we have a vote on this? Like, this is insane. And, the price inflation that we've had over the last few years is a direct result of the spending during COVID. And sorry, because I'm sure there's a lot of Trump supporters listening, but like Trump was sitting there bragging about how it was the biggest bill ever, because that's like how Donald Trump thinks, like I have the biggest building.
Wall's going to be big.
The biggest spending bill
is going to be big.
But look, all of this stuff, it's not just the foreign policy status quo, but it's all, and this is like the thing that I think, so my big thing is I think libertarians need to learn a conservative lesson and conservatives need to learn a libertarian lesson. And I think the libertarians need to learn like a conservative cultural lesson. That it's like you can have the attitude that people are free and ought to be able to do what they want as long as they're not, violently imposing on other people. But that doesn't mean you have to celebrate degeneracy. That doesn't mean you have to be on this. That doesn't mean you can't have and in fact, if government's not going to regulate things, then you kind of need social stigmas to regulate things. So I'm like very pro shaming and judgmental culture. But I think conservatives really need to learn a libertarian lesson about the role of government. Because the whole game right now, and this is what I really think is missing from the Trumpist populist movement, is that Trump talks about drain the swamp. And that resonates so much with everybody because everyone knows this whole system is so corrupt. And obviously it is. I mean, look, the most millionaires in the country are in Washington, D.C. And the richest counties are all the suburbs that surround Washington, D.C. And why? That's not capitalism. It's not because, there's these great big factories that make all the things in Washington, D.C. It's not Silicon Valley's in Washington, D.C. or some center of industry. And, the other richest counties are all outside of New York City. But that's not capitalism. They're not producing anything. That's just because Nixon took us off the gold standard and now you have this fiat money casino there. But anyway, my point is, draining the swamp means drastic cuts in federal spending. And if you don't have that, you're never draining the swamp. That's the whole corruption right there. The reason why there's so many millionaires in Washington, D.C. is because our central federal government spends $6 trillion a year.
Yeah. Well, D.C. is a brothel, is what I say. D.C. is a brothel.
Yeah.
It's a bunch of prostitutes in Congress
that
shake their butts for the highest spender, right? And that is what happened with Big Pharma. When they want to get something passed, we have more Big Pharma lobbyists than we have congressmen on the Hill.
Yeah.
The idea of even being able to lobby, how could you not think that is going to lead to corruption? And you are absolutely correct. And you do not have to, say, and not to drag on Trump, because that we need to have the freedom. If we're ever going to get to a solution, we need to have the freedom to say that this person is not perfect, this person is not perfect, to be able to have a full conversation to stop this weird idea that if you are a person, you are either all good or all bad. Even that is a form of psychology that drives me crazy. Like if I tweeted right now that Stalin said 2 + 2 = 4 and I agree, they would be like, Candace Owens is supporting Stalin. No, sometimes even somebody that you disagree with can say something that is correct.
Right. And it doesn't mean you have to give up your entire identity. I'm not saying that to conservatives. And I'm not saying you can't respect the fact that Donald Trump came around and said some really important things and was totally right about immigration and foreign policy, and he got so much heat for this, but he was totally right that all these wars were stupid and that having open borders is unsustainable and you can't have a nation without a border and all of that stuff. He was right. He was right when he questioned NATO, and also he was framed by his own intelligence agency as committing treason. He was framed for treason by his own intelligence communities. All of that's true. But then also it's true that he totally failed to drain the swamp, and there's a lot of reasons for that. And let's look at that. Okay, he appointed so many of the wrong people, like so many terrible
I'd
appointments.
like to hear him say that too.
Yeah, the closest I ever saw was he said like to Maria Bertoramo, she pushed him at one point on how he didn't drain the swamp, and he kind of said, "But it's Trump, you know. Trump's limited by being Trump. He's a very unique person, you know. So like, but he had one moment where he was like, you know, I didn't really know anyone when I came here. I didn't really know who was who. But then of course he's Trump. So then the next sentence he goes, now I know people better than anyone's ever known people. I know that, you know, that's how he operates. But the truth is that, you know, he was just talking about building the FBI a new building. Like, these are the people who framed you for treason, man. They literally attempted a coup in the United States of America. They tried to overthrow the guy. Andrew McCabe said on 60 Minutes, he said that we sat around and they had a meeting at the Department of Justice, the top people, about whether to invoke the 25th Amendment. Like, they were talking about how do we remove this guy? And then they realized they couldn't get enough of the cabinet, so they settled on Mueller.
Yeah. I think a lot of the things that he did, and I would love for him to say this, he did come quite close. Actually, I interviewed him over at Mar-a-Lago a couple of years ago, and I asked him the question. I said, if you could undo certain things, if you could do things differently, rather, like, would you not have hired certain people that were close to you? I'm paraphrasing myself here. But he came close, and he did say that there were some people that he would never want to see again. And I think the reason why he did it was perhaps because it was so crazy leading up to his election, then he wanted to make peace, right? So I think that's also the reason why he didn't lock up Hillary Clinton, where he's like, okay, I think he wrongly thought the election is over. Now things are going to return to normalcy. I've won. So let me just give them a couple of things here to show them that, like, okay, now we're got to get the job done. And what he ended up giving them was putting people in his cabinet who should have never been within his cabinet, not actually pursuing Hillary Clinton, believing that they would not pursue him into the future. I think he, and all of us, by the way, underestimated just how far they would go when they got the keys again. Because we're seeing stuff here in America that I don't think we've ever seen ever.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that America has done that are like horrible things. You know, I mean, there's many great things. I mean, the government has done some really bad things. The government has lied the people into war. The government's done all types of horrible things throughout its history. This does feel like something different. Like, this isn't something that America does. You know, like, yeah,
it is.
Well, now it is.
It is
now it is
overseas.
Well, that's right. That's right.
This is what's interesting about why we're at this moment now where people are starting to question the government. For the first time ever, they kept us in the dark, so to speak, and I'm just saying this as like a public school education 9/11 type kid, about what we were doing overseas intentionally, while convincing us that we were receiving an education. We actually weren't really receiving an education. We were receiving marching orders.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the first time, because of Trump, which is why I am so grateful that Donald Trump was president of the United States, because it led to this awakening, they turned the guns on the American people. They've never done it before, right? They've never done what they did on January 6th. And so now American people, when they're being called terrorists, it makes you go back and you go, well, if you're calling an American a terrorist for supporting a president, if you're calling an American a terrorist for exercising their right to free speech, what about all those other people you told us were terrorists and this was the reason that we needed to go overseas and drop some bombs? This is how it's starting to work in the American psyche. We're working backwards now. Yeah,
well, I mean, think about it. Like, these are people who are really comfortable with supporting wars where hundreds of thousands of people die because it enriches their friends. And just, if you could get yourself into that mentality, if you're that callous, but what we feel like, yeah, but they would never do that to us or something. You know what I mean? It's like, it's almost like if you found out someone was like a pedophile and you let them babysit your kids, and you were like, well, they did that to other kids in Iraq. You know what I mean? But they wouldn't do that to my kids here. It's like, no, I think the lesson is that person will be nowhere near my kids. And so I think that Donald Trump really, I think it was more symbolic than anything else. But he represented such a repudiation of the establishment and telling the American people that they are so corrupt and so stupid and have totally, mismanaged the United States of America. And in a sense, supporting that guy when everybody told you, like everybody at CNN told you, you're not allowed to, and you supported him anyway. That in their mind is like treason. Mm-hmm. That's like, oh, you're the enemy. So really, and if you look at this, it's not that there aren't really terrorists and there aren't really bad people all around the world. Most of the world is filled with them. But if you actually look at, like, say, the crimes of what Saddam Hussein committed, the crime of what Muammar Gaddafi committed, the crime of what Bashar al-Assad committed, it has nothing to do with what they tell you. It's not like Bashar al-Assad was killing all of his own people was the line. It's not that they're oppressive. We're in business with the Saudis. We're in business with Israel. The question isn't how oppressive are you to people who are helpless. The crime that they committed is that they were not on board with the American empire. They were not subservient to it. I mean, this is the same issue that we have with Iran. It's the same issue with Vladimir Putin. And John Mearsheimer points this out, and he's one of the best guys to listen to on foreign policy about all this stuff. Totally brilliant guy. And he just knows everything. But he pointed out that you go back and find me a quote before the year 2015 about anybody saying that Vladimir Putin is an imperialist, anybody saying that he wants to reconstitute the Soviet Union. Find it. You're not going to find it anywhere. Okay? Nobody was saying this because he's never said anything like that, and he's never demonstrated it. And this is after like the conflict in Georgia, and he had like a few little skirmishes like that. What happened is in 2015, he committed the ultimate crime. And what the ultimate crime was is he went into Syria when he was invited in by the government of Bashar al-Assad, and he denied America a regime change in Syria, and it worked.
And there's a reason,
and that's why they hate him.
And there's a reason he denied it. And so I want to first back this up because I have a clip that I want to show people now that you're listening and we're talking about foreign policy. I want to invite you into this discussion, but also to know that you don't have to be afraid to ask questions. You don't have to be like, oh my gosh, I'm realizing how little I know. That's fine, right? Don't let people make you think that you are stupid. That was their intention. They didn't want you to have access to this information. We're all, like I said, descending out of this cloud or this fog, rather, so to speak. So this is a clip, by the way, when we talk about how they just start labeling people terrorists whenever they go against not American interests. We shouldn't call them American interests because America's not doing great either, right? We're talking about a very small group of people who are benefiting tremendously by what's happening. We're talking about the military-industrial complex. We're talking about, I've got questions about what we were really doing in Afghanistan, with the poppy fields. And so this is Hillary Clinton admitting that, we fund the people and we work with people that eventually we call them terrorists. Take a listen.
We also have a history of kind of moving in and out of Pakistan. I mean, let's remember here, the people we are fighting today, we funded 20 years ago. And we did it because we were locked in this struggle with the Soviet Union. They invaded Afghanistan, and we did not want to see them control Central Asia. And we went to work. And it was President Reagan, in partnership with the Congress, led by Democrats, who said, you know what, sounds like a pretty good idea. Let's deal with the ISI and the Pakistani military, and let's go recruit these mujahideen, and let's get some to come from Saudi Arabia and other places, importing their Wahhabi brand of Islam so that we can go beat the Soviet Union. And guess what? They retreated. They lost billions of dollars, and it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's a very strong argument, which wasn't a bad investment to end the Soviet Union, but let's be careful what we sow because we will harvest. So we then left Pakistan. We said, okay, fine. You deal with the stingers that we've left all over your country. You deal with the mines that are along the border. And by the way, we don't want to have anything to do with you. In fact, we're sanctioning you. So we stopped dealing with the Pakistani military and with ISI, and we now are making up for a lot of lost time.
I love that for her.
Yeah, isn't it funny? Isn't it so Hillary Clinton that, of course, so she lays this all out, and then her conclusion is, of course, the exact wrong one. And so the problem is that we left. The problem isn't that we were funding terrorists over the world. The problem is that then we left. We didn't occupy them forever, right? We're not just more trillions of dollars in debt now because we were occupying Pakistan for all these years or whatever. But the crazy thing is that, like, look, even if you can, first you lay that out there, and that's pretty damning already, right? That she's just admitting, like, yeah, we funded and armed Osama bin Laden and taught him about how to lure a superpower into a war in Afghanistan to bleed them dry and bankrupt their country. And, like, yeah, that worked. Unfortunately, it worked on us too. So, like, even if you say, hey, look, at the time, we thought this would bring down the Soviet Union, it contributed to bringing down the Soviet Union, and then we ended up with 9/11. You would think the takeaway from that, seeing as how you are an American, senator, an American secretary of state, an American who was running for president twice, that you'd be like, oh, look what I cost my own people, you know, in an effort to like what, protect the people of Eastern Europe from the communism and then we got ourselves into this. But forget that, because after the fact of 9/11, it was Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State who was the chief advocate for the war in Libya, in which case we fought on the side of the Sunni jihadists, the Al-Qaeda members. And then it was the policy in Syria under Obama. This, I guess, was after Hillary Clinton was out, when Kerry was in. But it was the policy to support the anti-Assad rebels. Now, who were the anti-Assad rebels in Syria? Well, they were the Sunnis. They were the insurgency from Iraq, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. But as soon as they marched over the line into Syria, they were getting Toyota trucks and American weapons. And so this is after 9/11. And, you know, for all the talk about Donald Trump being a Russian spy or whatever, you know, like treason does have a definition. And last I checked, giving aid and comfort to the enemy during wartime would meet that definition. And so, like, that's what Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are guilty of. Literal treason. And whatever. But so the argument that you would justify after these terrorists turned on us, now they become terrorists, not freedom fighters, you know, because they're attacking us, but that you would still keep funding them after that is really insane. And by the way, the same thing is true in Yemen, where we're on the side of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula over there, because the Houthis are our enemies. And why is that? Because now we're trying to fight against the Shiites. And the Shiites never attacked us. They've never been they're not ISIS, they're not Al-Qaeda. What they are is the group of Muslims who are standing up for the Palestinians, ironically, because we've bought off all the Sunni Gulf states. But so now we have to fight them.
You've heard me talk about how important it is to have a VPN to protect your online privacy, and choosing a VPN that you trust is equally as important. I can confidently say that ExpressVPN is the best VPN on the market. For starters, ExpressVPN doesn't log your online activity. Many cheap or free VPNs make money by selling your data to advertisers. But ExpressVPN doesn't do this. They have even developed a technology called Trusted Server that makes their VPN servers incapable of storing data. ExpressVPN also uses Lightway, a new VPN protocol they engineered to make user speeds faster than ever. It is always blazing fast and let me stream videos in HD quality with zero buffering. Not to mention, it's also incredibly easy to use. You don't need any technical skills to set it up. You just fire up the app and tap one button to connect. Even your grandparents can do it. It's not just me that's saying this either. Business Insider, The Verge, and many other tech journals rate ExpressVPN as the #1 VPN in the world. So protect yourself with the VPN that I use and trust. Use my link at expressvpn.com/Candace today and get an extra 3 months free on a 1-year package. Visit expressvpn.com/Candace. That's expressvpn.com/Candace to learn more.
So I want to slow this down because I know a lot of my listeners were like me. What is this guy talking about?
Sure.
He clearly really likes this stuff. He's saying all sorts of stuff. He's bringing up names. And it's just amazing that you started that in talking about Libya and talking about Gaddafi, because what I want to now present to my audience is, and you had no idea that I have this in my lap at all, this is a speech from Gaddafi, who was the president of Libya. He was also, obviously, Libya was a member state of the UN, and we should just park it here because I want to read pieces of this speech. It is definitively the reason we killed him. I have read this speech so many times. It's shocking to me what he's laid out. It's shocking to me what he said. I want to say, by the way, before this, it doesn't matter what I say, right?
Doesn't matter.
Anything he did, that was terroristic. I condemn. Okay, fine. Can we talk about this anyways? Because this was a speech given at the UN, so I can't see what would be problematic about reading a speech that was read at the UN, other than the fact that you want people to remain ignorant and to believe the narrative that we went in there and we killed him simply because, you know, he suddenly became a terrorist. And that was the reason why we funded militant groups against him. Okay. So I've highlighted so we can go through this, and I want to just kind of go through it slowly. He gets up there. Actually, he's feeling optimistic because he was under some delusion that a Barack Obama presidency was going to be different. We all were under the same delusion, by the way. Barack Obama, this means peace. This means less racial strife. Yeah. Well, globally, they were under this same delusion. He starts out by just talking about the United Nations, just talking about why it was formed. He says, the United Nations was formed by nations that joined together after Germany in the Second World War. those countries formed a body called the Security Council, made its own countries permanent members, and granted them the power of veto. He starts talking about the Charter of the United States and how the preamble is very appealing, but all the provisions that follow it completely contradict the preamble, right? So just to be clear there to people, when the United States was established following World War II, there were 4 states that were allowed to just veto no matter what. They could veto it. So that just gives them obviously power. France, UK, the Russian Federation, and China also joined, is also a member of the Security Council. So he says, the preamble of the charter states that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. That is the preamble that we agreed to and signed. It says that armed force shall only be used in the common interest of all nations. But what has happened since then? 65 wars have broken out since the establishment of the United Nations and the Security Council. 65 since their creation, with millions more victims than the Second World War. That seems like a conflict. Are those wars and the aggression and force that were used in those 65 wars in the common interest of us all? No. They were in the interest of 1 or 3 or 4 countries, but not all nations. The preamble also states that if armed force is used, it must be a United Nations force. Thus, military intervention by the United Nations with the joint agreement of the United Nations, not 1 or 2 or 3 countries using armed force. The entire United Nations will decide to go to war to maintain international peace and security. If a country, Libya for instance, were to exhibit aggression against France, then the entire organization would respond because France is a sovereign state member of the United Nations, and we should all share the collective responsibility to protect the sovereignty of all nations. However, 65 aggressive wars have taken place without any United Nations action to prevent them. We joined the United Nations because we thought we were equals, only to find that one country can object to all the decisions that we make. Who gave the permanent members their status in the Security Council? 4 of them granted the status to themselves. The only country that we in the Assembly elected to permanent member status in the Security Council is China. This was done democratically, but the other seats were imposed upon us undemocratically through a dictatorial process carried out against our will, and we should not accept it. So let's just pause there and talk about that vision for the United Nations, coming out of World War II, and we just want to maintain security. How's it going?
Well, so it's a very interesting speech. I mean, the fundamental flaw that Gaddafi is making in it, which maybe it isn't a flaw, and maybe just being the perspective of the leader in Libya, this is the only thing you can really say. But the truth is that what we all know, this was never about like some type of global, like sharing of governance. That's
what I learned in my history book. What are you saying?
But it was so obviously like, look, this was about empire. And this was about like, we're going to stack the world government in favor of us so that we get to rule this thing. And that's what it's been ever since. And, obviously, like there were competing interests. I mean, there was the Soviet Union who was competing also to be the world empire. But it's obvious that, and this is one of the things, Putin mocks this all the time too in his speeches, and it's kind of entertaining to read or listen to them. But it's like everybody knows this whole thing where you have all the political class in America being like, Putin violated international law. It's like, oh, shut up. You are the biggest hypocrite in the world. There's no, look, the reality is that when you get to a high enough level of power, there's no such thing as law. And that's always been true. And that's always what's going on here. I mean, how many times do you have even people who are like, the biggest proponents of the war in Gaza right now? I just had Bobby Kennedy on my podcast, and we got into a pretty heated argument over it. And I really like a lot of things about Bobby Kennedy, but I just really think he's so wrong on this war. But even like he concedes, oh yeah, the settlements are totally illegal. Oh yeah, you know what I mean? Like it's like, and he concedes that, and almost everybody recognizes that the occupation is illegal, and almost everybody recognizes that, you know what I mean? But it's just kind of like, yeah, but we're still going to fund your war, because I don't know, you're one of the people who get to break international law, but Vladimir Putin does it, and oh my God, you're a war criminal. Like a war criminal? What exactly does this mean? Someone please look me in my eyes and tell me Dick Cheney and George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, these people aren't war criminals? Mm-hmm. I mean, get out of here with that. So obviously the whole thing was always, the whole liberal rules-based order is just that we don't have to follow the rules, but it's an excuse for us to impose those rules on everybody else. Which, doesn't that just sound like government in general?
Right.
Doesn't that just sound like everything? I think about the pictures of Nancy Pelosi and then, Dianne Feinstein not wearing masks in the middle of COVID when they were telling all the rest of us to. That's just the attitude that rulers have.
Right.
These are rules for you.
Yeah.
They don't apply to me.
Yes, exactly. And I think what you're hinting at, obviously, we learn about this in the classroom. That's why I go back to what we think when you're in this fog is no, this was after World War. It was such an incredible war. You spent so much time learning about World War II. And then what we wanted to do after was just be peaceful. And so this was the idea of international liberalism. Democratic values work. We're going to spread these principles across the world. We're going to defend people. We were establishing the United Nations. And we are also going to establish NATO. But this is purely going to be about peace. Like, our main aim is peace. And that's what Gaddafi is calling out when he decides that he's going to speak some truth to power, because he's going, wait a second, why does peace starting to look a little bit like imperialism dressed up? When you get under that bunny costume, it kind of looks like maybe you're just imperializing, and that this is just an extension of Cold War in the sense that it's the West versus the East kind of fighting for power. So he moves on. He says, at present, the Security Council is security feudalism, political feudalism for those with permanent seats, protected by them and used against us. It should be called not the Security Council, but the Terror Council. If they have an interest to promote an axe to grind, this is injustice and terrorism, and it should not be tolerated by us. And they use the veto power to protect those interests. For example, in the Security Council, they use the power of the United Nations to protect their interests and to terrorize and intimidate the Third War, causing it to live in this under the shadow of terror. From the beginning, since it was established in 1945, the Security Council has failed to protect security. Then he sort of starts unpacking everything, all of these wars that you're talking about. And he addresses Obama. He believes that we would be content if Obama could remain president of the United States of America forever, he says. These are words that will, he's dead now. And like thinking about him saying this right before they killed him is quite stunning. He says, American presidents used to threaten us with all manner of weapons, saying that it could send Desert Storm, grapes of wrath, rolling thunder, and poisonous roses for the Libyan children. That was their approach. American presidents used to threaten us with operations sent to Vietnam, Desert Storm sent to Iraq, Musketeer sent to Egypt in 1956, even though Americans opposed it, and the poisonous roses visited upon Libyan children by Reagan. Can you imagine? One would have thought that presidents of a large country with a permanent seat on the Security Council and the right of the veto would have protected us and sent us peace. He then says, we are about to put the United Nations on trial. The old organization will be finished and a new one will emerge. A country that was a sovereign state, Egypt, was attacked. Its army was destroyed. Thousands of Egyptians were killed and many Egyptian towns and entities were destroyed, all because Egypt wanted to nationalize the Suez Canal. How could such a thing have happened during the era of the United Nations and its charter? Those were dangerous events, and the Suez Canal and Korean War files should be reopened. Next, we come to the Vietnam War. There were 3 million victims of that war. During 12 days, more bombs were dropped than during 4 years of the Second World War. And it took place after the establishment of the United Nations. Then Panama was attacked, even though it was an independent member state of the General Assembly. 4,000 people were killed, and the president of that country was taken prisoner and put in prison. We should open that file. How can we entitle a country that is a United Nations member state to wage war against another country and capture its president, treat him as a criminal, and put him into prison? Then there was the war in Grenada. That country was invaded even though it was a member state. It was attacked by 5,000 warships, 7,000 troops, and dozens of military aircraft, and it is the smallest country in the world. This occurred after the establishment of the United Nations and of the Security Council. We must look into and investigate the bombing of Somalia. We want an investigation. Why did that happen? Who gave the green light for that country to be attacked? Then there is the former Yugoslavia. No country was as peaceful as Yugoslavia, constructed step by step and piece by piece after being destroyed by Hitler. We destroyed it as if we were doing the same job as Hitler. Tito built that peaceful country step by step and brick by brick, and then we arrived and broke it apart for imperialistic personal interests. How can we be complacent about that? How can we not be satisfied? Then we have the war in Iraq, the mother of all evils. The invasion of Iraq was a violation of the United Nations Charter. It was done without any justification by the superpowers with permanent seats on the Security Council. Iraq is an independent country and a member state of the General Assembly. How could those countries attack Iraq? As provided for in the Charter, the United Nations should have intervened and stopped the attack. We were against the invasion of Kuwait, and the Arab countries fought Iraq alongside foreign countries in the name of the United Nations Charter. Because the reasons for the attack remain mysterious and ambiguous, and we might face the same destiny, why was Iraq evaded? More than 1.5 million Iraqis were killed. We want to bring the Iraqi file before the ICC, that's the International Criminal Court, and we want those who committed mass murder against the Iraqi people to be tried. And he starts talking about what happened to Saddam Hussein, who was the president of Iraq. Why is it that Iraqi prisoners of war can be sentenced to death? When Iraq was invaded and the president of Iraq was taken, he was a prisoner of war. He should not have been hanged. When the war was over, he should have been released. Who sentenced the president of Iraq to death? We know the identity of the judge who tried him. As to who tied the noose around the president's neck on the day of sacrifice and hanged him, those people wore masks. How could this have happened in a civilized world? These were prisoners of war of civilized countries under international law. Why do the executioners not unmask their faces? Why do we not know their ranks? Why do we not know whether they were officers, judges, soldiers, or doctors? How does it come about that the president of a state member of the United Nations was sentenced to death and killed, and we do not know the identity of the executioners? The United Nations is duty-bound to answer these questions. That would be true for an ordinary citizen, let alone for the president of a state member of the United Nations who was put to death in that manner. My third point on the Iraq War relates to Abu Ghraib. This was a disgrace to humankind. Prisoners of war held in Abu Ghraib prison were torturers. Dogs were set on them. Men were raped. This is unprecedented in the history of war. It was sodomy. Ironic, given how he died. And it was an unprecedented sin never before committed by past aggressors or invaders. Turning to the war in Afghanistan, this too must be investigated. Why are we against the Taliban? Why are we against Afghanistan? Who are the Taliban? If the Taliban want a religious state, that should be fine. Think of the Vatican. Does the Vatican pose a threat to us? No, it's a religious and very peaceful state. If the Taliban want to create an Islamic state, who says that this makes them an enemy? Is anyone claiming that bin Laden is of the Taliban or that he is an Afghan? Is bin Laden of the Taliban? No, he is not of the Taliban and he is not an Afghan. Were the terrorists who hit New York City of a Taliban? Were they from Afghanistan? They were neither Taliban nor Afghan. Then what was the reason for the wars in Iraq and in Afghanistan? If I truly wanted to deceive my American and British friends, I would encourage them to send more troops, and I would encourage them to persist in this bloodbath, but they will never succeed in Iraq or Afghanistan. Look what happened to them in Iraq, which is a desert. It is even worse in the mountainous Afghanistan. This speech is honestly incredible. He then asks who killed Patrice Lumumba. He asks then he gets to American stuff, and this gets crazy. Then there is the assassination of United States President Kennedy in 1963. We want to know who killed him and why. There was somebody called Lee Harvey Oswald, who was then killed by one Jack Ruby. Why did he kill him? Jack Ruby, an Israeli, killing Lee Harvey Oswald, who killed Kennedy. Why did this Israeli kill Kennedy's killer? Then Jack Ruby, the killer of Kennedy, died in mysterious circumstances before he could be tried. We must open the files. The whole world knows that Kennedy wanted to investigate the Israeli Dimona nuclear reactor. Then there is not the whole world, definitely Americans don't know anything about it.
Yeah, really.
It's the whole world. Then there is the assassination of Martin Luther King, the Black reverend and human rights activist. His assassination was a plot, and we should know why he was killed and who killed him. Then he talks about Somalis protecting their own food and being called terrorists. And this is probably the craziest part. He said, we are addressing the phenomena of piracy and terrorism in the wrong way. And then he starts talking about viruses. Today there is the swine flu. Perhaps tomorrow there will be the fish flu. Because sometimes we produce viruses by controlling them. It is a commercial business. Capitalist companies produce viruses so that they can generate and sell vaccinations. That is a very shameful and poor ethics. Vaccinations and medicines should not be sold. Eliminate weapons of mass destruction, not landmines. With regard to the Palestinian situation, the two-state solution is impossible. Partition is doomed to failure. A buffer zone cannot be created between the two states because there are 500,000 Israeli settlers in the West Bank and 1 million Arab Palestinians in the territory known as Israel. The solution is therefore a democratic state with without religious fanaticism or ethnicity. Look at the Palestinian and Israeli youth. They both want peace and democracy, and they want to live under one state. This conflict poisons the world. Arabs have no hostility or animosity towards Israel. Yeah, I would say this is a how-to guide to how to get yourself killed by the CIA.
It's been so. I remember listening to this speech with like the UN translation when it happened. I completely forgot that he talked about man-made viruses and selling vaccines to people. That really was a nice cherry on top. And look, there's always been a history of this. So if anybody does have the knee-jerk reaction, because I know there are some times where it's the social psychology of it. It's hard for us to listen to some dictator of a third world country telling us how corrupt and awful we are. And there's a fair point to be like, you have issues in your own house too. There's plenty of issues with human rights abuses in that part of the world. But in the same way that, like Stalin used to always talk about how horrible segregation in America is and how bad they treat black people in the South in America. And of course, you could easily look at that and be like, okay, Joseph Stalin, like, who are you to... But he's also right about that. You know what I mean? And like, so he is making really good points about how corrupt this thing is. And so if nothing else, it's like, hey, let's not hand them this easy propaganda. But, as you go through all of the wars there, it's like... One of the things that I think people should keep in mind, and I know you were just talking about this on your, I think it was on your last episode, just talking about all the lies at the beginning of the Ukraine war, right? Where they're telling us all these things about how, whatever, the ghost of Kiev, or like all these things about how Vladimir Putin's getting humiliated and all of this stuff. And this happens in every single war, And I would really just encourage to kind of connect all of this here. If you've never heard of this, to read A Clean Break. And A Clean Break was a document. It was a letter written in 1996. And it was written by Richard Pearl and David Wormser. Richard Pearl went on to serve in the George W. Bush administration, very influential neoconservative. And they basically wrote in this letter that we should overthrow Saddam Hussein in Iraq, that this should be our next move. And the letter was not to Bill Clinton. The letter was not to Bob Dole, who was running for president that year. The letter was to Benjamin Netanyahu. They sent this letter to Benjamin Netanyahu saying, for Israel's interests, we think we ought to overthrow the government of Saddam in Iraq for Israel's interests. And so I'm just saying there's a huge connection in all of this between like a lot of these wars. There's a lot of people who support them, and they support them because they think it's in Israel's interest. Now, you could easily argue that they were really stupid to do this, because actually overthrowing Saddam Hussein just gave the country to the Shiites, who are allied with Iran, who now they're telling everyone is the biggest threat. So now we got to go fight that war.
For 33 years.
Right. Now we got to go fight that war. But just the point is that after 9/11, when you have this, he's got weapons of mass destruction, and he was helping Osama bin Laden. He was in on 9/11. He's going to hit the weapons he doesn't have to the terrorists he's not friends with, and then they're going to nuke Kansas. Whatever this propaganda was. These people had they've been saying for years the real reason they wanted to do it. It's so cynical that they just went, oh, America is so scared after 9/11 that we can get a bonus war now. We can not only get this war in Afghanistan, but now's the time that we could convince them.
We can do the most.
To do. So it's like there are real reasons why they fight these wars, and they lie through their teeth to us about what they are. So that's just what's worth knowing. And that's, I saw you were talking about this on Twitter, but that's why it's so great that Tucker Carlson's going over there to Russia right now, because it's like it behooves Americans to understand our enemies. Maybe even understand if they are actually our enemies.
Understand our history.
Yes, but to know what's going on here. What is the reaction here? Why is that? Look, the wisest member of the George W. Bush administration was undoubtedly Colin Powell. And he still, even though he didn't want to go into Iraq and he knew it was all lies, he still went and sold it. So I'm not giving him a free pass here, but he was at least the wise. And he said after 9/11, He told George W. Bush, you have to do a two-state solution now. That's what you have to do. You have to give the Palestinians a state, because he understood that this is at the heart of our terrorism problem here, is that they know that Israel can only do this to the Palestinians because America backs them up. And so they blame us. This was in Osama bin Laden's letter to America, right? It's like one of the first grievances he lists. That and our bases in Saudi Arabia and the war in Iraq and all that stuff. The first war under H.W. Bush. So he went to Georgia, and George W. Bush was enough like Colin Powell was like, okay, well, if Colin Powell says it, then I guess I got to do it. And it was Tom DeLay in the House who told George W. Bush, he goes, well, I can guarantee you will be a one-term president if you do that, because AIPAC will be on you. All of the neoconservatives will turn on you. And I got tens of millions of evangelical Christians who will not vote for you if you don't support Israel and what they want to do.
Wow.
And so that's kind of but
that's, you saying that's in this book?
That's John Mearsheimer wrote all about it. Yeah, you can go check that out if you just Google those keywords with Mearsheimer.
This is, by the way, what we call the non-expert problem. I think Scott Adams notoriously called this the non-expert problem regarding something else, but essentially you don't know enough information about the thing, right? So then you're kind of relying on people that are emotionally engineering things to tell you what side you should be on, but it takes an expert to kind of go back and unpack and explain to you what happened. But then you also create the problem of like, can you trust the expert? So I had never heard of this ever about this is all new.
Well,
to me.
one more thing I'd recommend looking to is Michael Scheuer. And I might be mispronouncing his last name a little bit, but he was the CIA chief of the Bin Laden unit. And he was a very high level CIA guy. And he said the same thing. You can find there's testimony of congressional testimony that he has and lots of speeches that he's given. He wrote a couple books, but he was right away. He was like, this is just like a CIA operations guy. He's not like me. Like, he's not coming out here and being like, it's so wrong what we're doing to these people, or something like that. Like, he's just like, if the order is to kill these people, then sir, yes, sir, I'll go kill these people. But it's my job to let you know the risks that come along with killing these people and blah, blah, blah. And he was just straight up like, look, this is the cost of supporting Israel. This is the cost of democracy spreading in the Middle East. The price is terrorism. Now, if you tell me that price is worth it to you, then okay, fine. We'll keep doing this and do that. But if I were to make a recommendation to you, I would say this price is not worth it. And there's no reason why we need to pay this price.
You know what's interesting is you're talking about Osama bin Laden,
Mm-hmm.
but Saddam Hussein as well, which is something that people don't know, which you can quite literally, Skylar, if you're hearing this, you can pull this up on the Wikipedia page of Saddam Hussein. This is not conspiracy at all, but obviously the invasion of Kuwait, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when this invasion was taking on, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, he said, this is our territory. It's actually technically supposed to be our territory. But what was that dispute there was also just a lot of Cold War stuff. Who's going to control the oil? Britain wasn't okay with this. A lot of their economy relied on Kuwait, right? And they're like, no. We got to go to a war with Iraq. This is a war that's about, this is about oil, really, at the end of the day, and how we are able to secure the wealth of the UK, right? Goes over, it's actually, I think, Margaret Thatcher at the time who met with Bush, but don't quote me on that. This is one of those famous things that they'll be like, no, a meeting didn't happen, and then they'll take it out and say, you're an idiot, it wasn't, whatever. Margaret Thatcher went over, convinced him that absolutely we're going to get involved because of oil. But I don't know if people know that Saddam Hussein, because at the time then both sides got involved, Russia got involved, and they started sort of negotiating because, again, this is just kind of the Cold War that never ends. And part of the negotiation, Saddam Hussein offered to leave Kuwait if things were guaranteed for the Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. But let's fact check that now, that what I'm saying is correct. If you could just look up the West Bank, maybe like a fine thing, because like I say, God forbid you say one thing. What does that say? During the negotiations and threats following the invasion, Saddam focused renewed attention on the Palestinian problem by promising to withdraw his forces from Kuwait if Israel would relinquish the occupied territories in the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip. Saddam's proposal further split the Arab world, pitting the U.S. and the Western-supported Arab states against the Palestinians. The Allies ultimately rejected any linkage between the Kuwait crisis and Palestinian issues. So that's like kind of what you're saying again, like, and people may not know this, but that's a fact. It's got to be true if it's on Wikipedia. But what I'm saying is the fact that it's made it to a Wikipedia page is
well, yeah, and it's like, so all of these guys, like tell us this is what we're pissed off at you about. Like this is what the beef is over. And we can just say, nah, they're all just saying that. And like, okay, I guess that's true that you don't know what's in someone's heart. And I don't know if Osama bin Laden really meant what he was saying or meant something else. And I don't know if Saddam Hussein really meant this, but I would just say like, and this is what's so strange. I think this is one of the things that, because I've watched a lot of your stuff talking about the war in Gaza since it's happened. And I think this is kind of one of the things that you just kind of instinctually got about it. But we're just kind of being right away like, but why can't we just apply the same standards to everyone? Like, why is it that we have to have this huge double standard? Because all of us understand when 9/11 happens, why we're all willing to go fight a war and kill whoever did this. Everyone gets that. Like, everyone gets like, oh, something violent happened here and we're all pissed off about it. And we got young boys who live in Hawaii who enlisted to go fight in the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq because New York City got attacked. Because they identify as Americans.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? And that to them, that's us. You attacked us. Why is it so crazy that Muslims would feel this way about their people when they're being attacked? That they'd be like, no, we're furious about this and we want to go get you. Everyone understands October 7th happened. And that's why Israel, you know, this is what I was arguing with Bobby Kennedy about the other day. He's just like, look, he's like, what country can live with something like that happening to them? And you're like, okay, fine.
Yeah,
but why do the Palestinians have to live with what's been happening to them? They've been living under totalitarianism since 1967. So why do they get to not be like, this is unacceptable? And it's that simple, really.
Sleep is the foundation of our mental and physical health. You must have a consistent nighttime routine to function at your very best. If you're struggling with sleep, you need to check out Beam. Other sleep aids can cause next-day grogginess, but Beam contains a powerful all-natural blend of L-theanine and melatonin to help you fall asleep, stay asleep, and wake up refreshed. It's not just your run-of-the-mill sleep aid either. It's a concoction carefully crafted to help you rest without the grogginess that often accompanies other sleep remedies. Several people on my team use Beam to sleep better through the night, and they show up very much ready to work. And today, my listeners get a special discount on Beam's Dream Powder, their science-backed healthy hot cocoa for sleep with no added sugar. Better sleep has never tasted better. Now available in delicious flavors like cinnamon cocoa, chocolate peanut butter, and mint chip, Better Sleep has never tasted better. You just mix Beam Dream into hot water or milk, stir or froth, and enjoy it before bedtime. If you find yourself struggling to sleep, give it a shot. You want to try Beam's best-selling Dream Powder, get up to 40% off for a limited time when you go to shopbeam.com/Candace and use code Candace at checkout. That's shopbeam.com/Candace and use code Candace for up to 40% off.
What are some of the treatment that you get being a Jewish person that says that? Because I think it's got to be like when I'm a Black American, but I don't support BLM. I don't support this at all. I think a lot of, people are lying here in the Black commentariat, so to speak, about what they're saying about BLM. I think it's actually ultimately going to be bad for Black Americans.
Right.
It's going to increase racism towards Black Americans because people are tired of just people spiking the ball here and saying that we should have special consideration. Like the color of skin allows me to do this, allows me to do that. I should be given this and that. Like that's not going to create a good sentiment amongst white Americans. And I've been saying that from the very beginning, and I've basically been proven right with time. But yeah, it wasn't a lot of Black Americans that were saying that. So what's the experience for you, like as a Jewish person that's, I guess, not saying what you're supposed to say or asking questions?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm phrasing that right.
No, I mean, it's not, this one's been challenging. And like, I don't even care. The other, like, I don't know, because, I get called a spouting.
It's got to be a self-hating Jew.
Yeah, you get that a lot. But I mean, like with other issues that I've taken, it just never even bothers me. It's like you're a Putin apologist or something like that. It's like, yeah, right. I'm sworn loyal to Vladimir Putin. It's just so ridiculous, the accusations. With this one, it's been more difficult because there's like family of mine who really don't like, that I have this position.
I went through the same thing.
Sure. Yeah.
BLM psychology was so,
Yeah, I just like, I really value telling the truth. I think it's a really important thing. I got kids. I got a son. I feel like that's got to be my example to him, is that, his father was someone who told the truth even when it was unpopular, at least as he saw it. And in this weird space that we all occupy in, where the internet has like destroyed the corporate monopoly on the flow of information, and we have all these shows and all these things, like that's our currency, is we tell the truth. Yeah. So I got to do that even when it's kind of uncomfortable. And, the thing is that people often, it's like if I criticize the George W. Bush administration for invading Iraq and, just this disastrous war that they clearly lied us into and had ulterior motives, and it was just a disaster. 1 million people died, and thousands of our young soldiers died, and tens of thousands of them blew their brains out after coming home, and cost trillions of dollars. So you could criticize all of that. This doesn't mean I hate America or I think Iraq's better than America.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm a libertarian. I'm a Western chauvinist. How could I not be?
Mm-hmm.
It's the only societies that have ever had any conception of really individual liberty. So I think there's actually lots of things about Israel that are better than the most of the Arab world. It's just wrong what they do to the Palestinians, and they shouldn't do it anymore. That's all. You know what I mean? And so it's like people have, again, it's like we were saying, the social psychology thing where they're kind of like, especially with Israel, which is a particularly peculiar case, where it's like if you criticize them, it is right in people's minds. Like they've been trained to hear, it's like, oh, so you hate Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what you're saying. And that's not at all what I'm saying, any more than I'm saying I hate people in Nashville because George W. Bush shouldn't have invaded Iraq. You know what I mean? Like, I think Israel's a cool country. They've made a country where it's a good place to live. I know, like, Ben Shapiro here at this network will make this point, that he'll say, hey, if you wanted to be an Arab living in the Middle East, there's no better place than to be living in Israel as an Israeli citizen. And that's true. And that's a fair enough point. You know what I mean? But you were way better off being an American citizen living in America than being an Iraqi citizen living under Saddam Hussein. That still doesn't mean it was justified for George W. Bush to invade the country, And so my thing is like just kind of explaining this to people, that it's like, look, this is what I think. This is what I think is right and wrong here. And I think it's important. I think it's important for people to step up and tell the truth. And as you know, as well as anybody, so much of this stuff is just weaponized. Like, it's just like, oh, well, I'm going to label you racist or sexist or anti-Semitic or any of this. And like, it's a bully tactic. And we all know what the answer to that is when someone bullies you. I don't know. Maybe I'm from a different time, but we all learned it as kids that like you have to stand up to a bully. You have to punch him in the nose and then he'll leave you alone.
I love that you said that, because that really, if I had to put a Candace doctrine on dealing with politics, I have learned to stand up to bullies, and at different times, the people that were bullied become the bullies. And so it takes a lot of nuance. It takes a lot of change, to recognize, okay, I used to agree with this person on this, but what they're saying right now is completely wild, which makes it even harder because sometimes it's people that you're friends with, people that you've respected in the past over certain stances that suddenly flip their entire, what you thought, I guess, was their operating thesis. And this issue in particular that you're talking about, like with Israel, well, first and foremost, like starting with the non-expert problem, starting with the emotional engineering, like something happens and people don't really know anything about what it is that's happening. People don't know about Ukraine and Russia and NATO and what assurances were provided. They just know that the media is telling you every single day that like Ukrainians are dying. And so they want you to jump into the conversation, but you don't know anything and you shouldn't do that. And so I've always just tried to say, hold up. Wait a second, who benefits from this emotionality? And I have to be honest, I was so confused coming into politics, and because I had no background in politics and seeing just everything that's happened in terms of, this widespread use of the term anti-Semitism. And it was especially confusing for me because I grew up in a town with a lot of Jewish people. My entire life, my best friend, by coincidence, I never even think of them as Jewish, but they were all Jewish, Best friend Denise in high school, best friend Ashley in college. I've attended more Rosh Hashanah dinners. It's weird how many Rosh Hashanah dinners I've been at. I know full Jewish prayers because I played the daughter in Fiddler on the Roof when I was in I'm like, after college, worked for an Orthodox Jewish family. Kids went to Rodef Shalom for school. I was friends with all of the, when I lived in New York, I dated and lived with a Jewish guy for 3 years. His brother was an Orthodox Jew. And we had a mezuzah on our door, right? And I've never said any of this stuff before publicly because I know that the threat is they want me to prove that I'm not anti-Semitic. And I'm like, no, the power of that how dare you come at me and try to accuse me. And this is when they made a real enemy of me. And I'm talking specifically when I say they, not Jewish people, because I know Jewish people, worked then in private equity for 2 Jewish people. Like Jewish people have just been a part of my life. They've helped me throughout life. They're my best friends. And so I was very surprised growing up with these people who never would call somebody anti-Semitic if they didn't do what they want to do. These people want to work hard. They want to be successful at whatever it is they love and that they do. I've never, until I got into politics, saw a different breed, right?
Yeah.
And politics is politics, right? Right. Suddenly people were realizing there's power if you stand behind your race and you can threaten people, this implicit threat that if you don't say what I want you to say at any moment, I'm going to smear you as an anti-Semite and everything you have is going to be over. I do not take kindly to threats.
Yeah, no, look, I completely agree. And it's just so, it's like, people, I've been called a self-hating Jew because I'm critical of Israel's government's policies. And it's just, you're like, yeah, I hate my mom and my sister and brother and half my kids because my wife's Catholic. But it's like, yeah, it's just too ridiculous. The truth is, the way I see it is I just hate this tendency amongst some Jewish people and some non-Jewish people to talk about anti-Semitism in America and all the time. And even before this war in Gaza, there's the talk anti-Semitism is on the rise,
but that's not the regular Jewish person.
No. I hate the people who are like that.
The political class.
Yes, but in the same way, but it's true with Black Americans too. Yes. It's like, yes, there are many liberal white people who really push this on Black people, but there are a certain number of them who buy into it, and for the same reasons, because it's like a seductive thing to buy into that you're the victim. Everybody in life, everybody has had moments of feeling sorry for yourself. And we all know that it's a seductive trap. There's something that feels kind of nice about being like, man, I should have gotten this, but I didn't get this, and someone else got this when I deserved it more. But also, every single successful person in the world knows that that is a bad force. And you have to find a way, if you're going to be successful in life, to stop feeling sorry for yourself. Stop playing the victim, take responsibility, blame yourself for your own failures, and move forward. And so it's awful that they get, but I look at my grandfather escaped Nazi Germany in 1938. And he was the only member of his family who survived. The all rest of them died. And he didn't live through the worst of the death camps and stuff like that. But he lived through the rise of the Nazis. He had several family members who were killed in front of him. His father's business was seized. I mean, truly a society that was cracking down on Jews and regular Jewish people who hadn't done anything, wrong. It was like a guy who was a shoemaker, you know what I mean? Didn't do anything to anyone, didn't deserve that. And he came over here on a boat where he got so sick he almost died, and then came over and built a life for himself here in this country. And I just feel like, as I'm Jewish, I've never had one obstacle in my way because I'm Jewish. Jews are 2% of the population in this country. We are incredibly successful. My attitude is just hey, what a great country. That's how we should be talking about this. I don't think it's helpful, and it's just kind of grosses me out when I see people who are like, oh, someone said something mean somewhere. Who cares?
That's literally BLM tactics. It's mirroring BLM tactics.
And it's not even, and the thing with BLM is with Black people, there's more of a thing where look, there are all these pockets of Black people who are not doing very well in America right now. So there is more of a conversation to be had there. Jews, it's just not true. We're very successful. The problem with the BLM is that it's white, female, liberal, upper middle class values all the way. That's what it always is. I remember me and my buddy, Jay Okerson, it's a really funny comedian. We used to do shows in Philly, and then we would drive back late night to New York, and we used to drive through Camden, New Jersey, just for the experience of driving through Camden, New Jersey, because it's kind of a rush and it's scary. If your car breaks down, you're probably going to die. You know what I mean? And you're kind of what? And I remember this one time, it's always stuck with me. This crazy. If you've never been to Camden, it's one of these places. There's lots of places like this, little pockets of a third world country in the middle of the United States of America. And it's not white people who are living in them. And I remember there was this one, it's half the houses are boarded up, and there's gangs hanging out, and there's hookers walking around on the street. And I just look over, and there was a kid. He must have been 3 years old. This is 2 in the morning, and he's just out by himself with no shoes. And there's no adult anywhere near this kid. And okay, yeah, that's a real problem. Mm-hmm. This is really a problem. And if you want to have a conversation about what we can do to help that kid, I'm all ears for that. Now, every government program has done nothing but fail these people. But if you want to have a real conversation about that, fine. But it always seems like Black Lives Matter activists, like, I've never even heard him once bring up that kid.
No.
I've never even heard him once talk about. What they will talk about is if a college professor said something that offended a black girl who was at an Ivy League school. And you're like, I don't care about that. Like, I don't care about that struggle. I don't care about the black kid who's at a college who's going to have a great life and is in a first world and is, like, whatever. Your feelings got hurt. Deal with it. But if you want to talk about like these kids who have nothing, okay, let's talk about. But then, of course,
you got to get into the politics
and
figure
then
out why they have. And then once you do the research and you understand, you suddenly become a black conservative.
And you're not allowed to say any of that. So if you want to have that conversation, you're only allowed to say systemic racism and inequality and
Right.
white
That's
people.
just not the truth.
And it's just
you
not.
know? We were
it's just-
outpacing white Americans in terms of economic growth. This was following slavery. And then what happened? LBJ gets into office. They start welfare policies. They start incentivizing black Americans to behave badly.
Yes,
Don't
that's
marry
right.
the father of your children. The breakdown of family. You say these things as a black conservative and you are persona non grata in the mainstream media simply because it's true. And the mainstream media exists to protect government interests, right?
Yeah.
And so that's what BLM was. It was a
Yeah.
government interest. They wanted to have all of these riots all across America, all across the globe. We had an election coming up. This was a government operation. BLM was a government operation, nothing really actually to do with black people. But the reason black people seized upon it and the reason why they put, that video, which actually was shot from the wrong angle, which made black people think that his neck was being for 9 minutes, that George Floyd's neck was being compressed, was because they wanted an emotional reaction, and they got the reaction they wanted because of the Department of Education, also the schooling, constantly reminding black Americans, again, going back to that tactic of trauma, that you were once a slave, you were once a slave, you were once a slave. So black Americans come out thinking, like, okay, all I know is that if anybody says the word slavery, I better react because, that happened in this country and it could happen again. Not realizing the people that are telling you that slavery is just around the corner are only saying it for their own benefit. And that's why I say I see these similarities happening, because I was just trying to put the pieces together as, I have Jewish friends who are legitimately like sharing posts, talking about the Holocaust and all of this stuff. And you can imagine that for a Jewish person coming up in the school person, all entire American school system actually was really impressed upon us about the Holocaust as well. It's another big event. You learn about you're seeing skulls. Like, that's a traumatizing thing for a kid to learn. You can imagine it's doubly traumatizing for a Jewish person. And that was not as long ago as slavery.
Right.
So that's going to be in the back of your mind. So when you have the commentariat that are saying, support this and say this and do this, or else the Holocaust is coming back, how could you not expect them to have a reaction? But who is gaining from that reaction? Actually, what it's doing is that it's making, like BLM did, is actually creating more of a sentiment against Jewish people, because people are going, why are they calling me why am I getting called anti-Semitic for asking a question?
Yeah.
And that's not good. It's not good to call people racist that are not racist. It's not good to call people anti-Semitic filth, a la Thomas Massey, who are not, in fact, anti-Semitic at all.
Yeah, of course. And what could be a better way to create more anti-Semitism, in the same sense of, like, what could be a better way to create more racism than images of, like, black people looting stores and beating people up and all of this stuff, right? Like, what's the natural now, obviously, it's not the correct reaction to blame all black people for that.
Right.
But you could see that, like, if you just keep playing this for white people over and over again, the natural human reaction is for a lot of those white people to be like, well, look at these black people. They're acting like animals. You know what I mean? And the same thing is true. I saw someone shared a poll where they were, like, talking about how a pretty shockingly high percentage of young people don't believe the Holocaust happened. It was something like 25% or something of people under 20 or something like that. And of course, their takeaway was, look, the education system has failed. Like, we're just not teaching people about the Holocaust.
That is not
And you're
right.
like, listen, okay, first of all, it's stupid that people don't believe the Holocaust happened. It definitely happened. Lots of people have done very deep dives on this, and you can go read all about it if you want to. But let's just understand what's going on here. People aren't questioning the Armenian genocide. People aren't questioning, like, lots of other genocides around the world. Why are they? It's not that they haven't been told about this. It's that you're cramming it down their throats, and then you're using it as the justification for a whole bunch of things that you're lying about. And so then people eventually just go to the conclusion, like, oh, maybe they were lying about that one too. Maybe this whole thing's a lie. But to think the idea that your takeaway would be like, we just haven't taught kids about the Holocaust enough, like, come on. That's just totally ridiculous. And so again, you can just see this. This is one of the things to me, like, it was just always easy for me to kind of understand reactionary movements. Like, it's just kind of obvious. That just always clicked for me. It always clicked. You remember there was this one scene in Good Will Hunting.
Love that movie, and I watched it recently, so come at me.
So there's a scene, well, it's the scene that everyone will remember, but it's where he finally opens up and starts talking about his foster dad's abuse, and he goes like, he used to lay out a stick, a belt, and a wrench, and Robin Williams is like, I got to go with the stick or something, and he goes, I used to pick the wrench. And he goes, why? Because F him, that's why. Now, I just remember there's something about that I could just totally get.
Right.
You just get that, right?
That's
like, I'm going to pick the wrench. I'm going to make you beat me just to show you, like, screw you. And it's just so easy for me to understand. It's like, oh, like, why did young black kids start identifying with people in prison, and that's why they'd start sagging their pantses and embracing this gangster culture. And it's like, yeah, because everything's failed them. So, like, screw you. Like, they're like, and why do these young Muslims become terrorists? It's like, I don't know, because they've watched their cousin get murdered in a drone campaign. So, like, it's just easy to understand this. But so it's obviously like when you have these people who are lying about war after war after war that does nothing but damage our country, and then you're calling them an anti-Semite if they don't support the next one. I just understand there's going to be this reactionary movement where people are like, yeah, you know what, that does describe me. Right. Anti-Semite it is.
Right.
And I don't want to see that. So, like, in the same way, you don't want to see any of these overcorrective reactionary movements. But so it's like, so stop prodding people.
Stop doing that thing. Stop calling people what they're not. Stop, because they ask a question, because they don't understand something particularly. And that's why I really blame, and I hope people listening to this who maybe are feeling like that, who are a part of that reaction, are going like, I'm just getting so tired of having this shoved down my throat and being called an anti-Semitic about something I don't even understand that's happening overseas. Pause, because this is not what the majority of Jews in America want. And
yeah, that's right.
They don't want this either. It's also being jammed down their throats. They are being called this, being called that. They're being told that the Holocaust is around the corner unless they support this. They're going through a very emotional thing right now. And the people that you should be mad at, actually, it's a very, very, very small fraction of people who have publications, who can publish something and make so it looks bigger than it is, but it's like one person who wrote this article to convince, like, it's that John Potteritz who just goes on and says Thomas Massey, it's anti-Semitic filth. So you're perceiving this and you're blaming all Jewish people in America perhaps because of this must be how they all feel. No, he's just an idiot.
Yeah, look.
And call him out for being a neocon, and call him out for being an idiot, and call out people that have the power to keep deluding the masses into hating one another, because they do it for their own selfish reasons. And that reason is always power, and it's always money. And I have such contempt for them, such contempt that you would divide people who love each other. I like to make fun of people because of their, backgrounds. We used to do that in America. They used to be cool and fun.
It was actually like how we bonded,
right,
and how we kind of bridged divides was like kind of mocking each other. Look, it's just like falling into the collectivist trap. And collectivism just makes people stupid. It's like racialism makes people stupid. They always just come to these conclusions that are so dumb. It's like when people will share, like, the memes of like, well, look at all these people in media and look how many of them have a Jewish star on them. And you're like, okay, but let me give you the leading voices against Israel's war. And guess what? There's a whole bunch of Jewish stars on those names too. So like, it just does, it's the same mistake feminists make when they'll just be like, well, look, 98% of the Fortune 500 CEOs are men. So men control this whole system. And you're like, that's men? That just describes all of us? Or you're talking about 500 men. You know what I mean? The most powerful, richest, elite that your average guy, your construction worker guy on the street doesn't really have that much in common with, actually. So it's like, no, that's you're just kind of repeating the same thing they do. And it's also the same, poisonous attitude that would justify collective punishment toward everybody in Gaza because of what a few Hamas militants did. So that's that's always the big enemy and that's the best part of Western civilization. The best part of the tradition is the idea of like individual justice, individual rights, individual responsibility. And so, yeah, I encourage people to reject all of that stuff. And, sometimes people will say, like, they'll be like, well, look, sometimes wars are justified. And I do think that's true. I do think there are such things as just wars. It's just that none of these current wars meet that standard, and none of them. And so, and look, there's this great, this is for conservatives, I think there's something to think of, because this is one of the greatest quotes I've ever heard in my life. I might slightly butcher it, but John Adams, it's a famous quote, but he said, if America goes around the world looking for monsters to destroy, we will become the dictatress of the world, but we will lose the power to control our own soul. And she's like, what a beautiful quote. And how much is like, wow, he actually predicted. And that's what happened. That America decided we're just going to fight wars constantly all around the world. And what's happening here to our own culture? It's like, yeah, we've lost our own soul. And there's a connection there, Like there's something about how like, when did the sexual revolution and like the counterculture revolution happen? It happened during Vietnam. It's like you go on these mass murder campaigns and you're on some spiritual level, you lose moral legitimacy. And now there's nothing to kind of like glue people together in a weird way. And then you just see like all types of degeneracy spiral out of that.
Yeah, I think that's where the military industrial complex messed up. Was like, if you were gonna keep justifying this, you at least had to like keep the roads paved over here. Like you had to make us think like, yes, no, like obviously things are going great. You had to keep up sort of the Brady Bunch delusion. You had to leave it to Beaver. Everybody's got mowed lawns. We obviously are seeing now that America is fully in decline. I'm optimistic. I think it can change around. I think it changes around once people start thinking. And you're then telling us that we can do both. We can do both. We can send money and fight in Ukraine, and we can, send money to Israel. We can send money to Afghanistan. We can do everything. Clearly, we can't. The evidence is in front of us. You're trying to get us to commit to the final instruction, the final Orwellian instruction, which is not to believe our own eyes. And Americans in this moment are starting to believe their own eyes. And they're starting to ask questions. And we're starting to ask questions about why this foreign policy, where we're spending nonstop money that we clearly don't have, is failing. And yet we're being told that we have to keep in it. We have to keep in it forever. And I do think that the point you just made is so important, is that they recognize that if they can get you to lean into these social issues and constantly keep us warring with one another, Candace, don't see yourself as a nuanced, independent thinker. See yourself as Black. Candace, don't see yourself as a nuanced, independent thinker. See yourself as a woman, right? Feminism is for you. Like, BLM is for you. Jewish people, don't see yourself as a nuanced individual, right? You need to see yourself as a Jew first and worry about 100%. The Holocaust. Black people worry about slavery. Women worry about the patriarchy. That is their bullshit, and I hate it.
Yes, 100%. And it's such a psyop. It's such an obvious psyop, too. Like, look, even when you were talking about, like, the George Floyd thing, right? Like, okay, and I'll, just for the record, I know there's, like, not even to get, like, too deep dive in, I know there were, like, 2 coroner's reports, and one said that it was the fentanyl, and the other one said it was the neck, or whatever. Not even getting into the details of that, I will just say, and not even saying whether Chauvin should have been convicted for murder or not, I personally would say, I thought the cops handled that very bad. There was like no attempt to de-escalate. If you watch the whole police cam video, he didn't seem like he was going to be a violent threat. He seemed like a drug addict who was having a massive panic attack. And I think it was totally unnecessary to have him cuffed on the ground and be kneeling on his neck. He asked to be put
on the ground, though.
Fine. I'm just saying, once he's cuffed on the ground, you don't need to be sitting on them with his knee. And so anyway, I think there would have been a much better way to handle that. But regardless, who made the decision that story was going to be national news?
Big question.
Things like this happen all the time. It's a country of hundreds of millions of people. There's police interactions all the time where there's something like this happens. Why was it on every single news station? Like, why was it constantly talked about? There are decisions that are made at very high levels, right? And if you know, and I'm sure you've seen this, but if you follow those Nexus charts and you follow all the woke words like racism, white supremacy, transphobia, any of them, put them into a Nexus chart right around 2012, it shoots up. Like all of a sudden, all of the most powerful corporate outlets, everyone in the political and media class decided we are going to start talking about these cultural issues. And it's obvious a distraction from the fact that like at this time, all of the wars had failed and the biggest recession in 100 years had come, and they had just totally looted the economy and totally like destroying the most powerful country ever. But now they would rather, you had Occupy Wall Street that was like outside the big banks. You had the Tea Party that was talking about government spending and debt. And they're like, yeah, we don't really like those issues. That hits a little too close to home. So all of a sudden, America is just talking about transgenderism every single day. And listen, because I don't want like conservatives to like misunderstand what I'm saying here. This was pushed on the American people as a distraction. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't get to a point where it's got to be fought back because the distraction becomes a real threat. And I am very particularly like all the stuff of pushing this on kids specifically is like insane child abuse and should be fought at every step of the way. But you could also like recognize that like don't take your eye off the ball because that's kind of what they want. And I think this is a thing that conservatives fall into a lot. Like, yes, is it absolutely ridiculous that a dude is competing with chicks in swimming? Yes. It's insane. It's so insane that I can't even believe it needs to be discussed as an issue. Like the fact that that's not a starting point for all of us is just bananas.
Yeah.
However, there are way more important things in the world going on than that. You know what I mean? And like it's not that that's not important, but it's nowhere near as important as like just what inflation has done to families over this country. Like how many families have broken up over the number one reason for divorce is financial problems. This inflation has destroyed people. I mean, this is the type of thing that leads to like, kids growing up without a father putting a gun in his mouth. You know what I mean? Like horrible things come out of it. These wars are the worst things in the world. And it's just like, just notice that, like, and once you try to notice this, I think it's almost impossible to not see it, that all of the people who are responsible for destroying the United States of America want you to be fighting with your fellow Americans. And that's all they want. And that's why they pick all these issues, race or sexuality or transgender, whatever, all this stupid stuff is just to constantly divide us against each other. Because the truth is that one of the few things that left America and right America have in common is that we're all screwed over by the same people. And that's them. It's a big club. And you ain't in it,
And the club ain't that big, by the way. And that's why I say it appears like it's really big because it's the media. I call them the commentariat who are making you hysterical all the time about so many different issues. And that's purposefully to divide you and to make you look the other way while, the military industrial complex just keeps on trucking through all of these countries.
We're experiencing a lot of global instability as we plunge into the 2024 election. What are you doing to protect your family in the midst of all this chaos? A great place to start is by protecting your savings. It's not too late to invest in gold with Birch Gold Group today. Unlike many other investments, gold is often viewed as a safe haven investment during turbulent times because it provides a hedge against inflation and economic uncertainty. Birch Gold will help you convert your existing IRA or a 401k into a tax-sheltered IRA in gold, and it will cost you nothing out of pocket. While diversification does not eliminate risk entirely, Birch Gold's experts can help you manage and reduce, providing a more resilient foundation for your financial well-being. Talk to one of their trusted experts today. Text Candace to 989898, and Birch Gold will send you a free info kit. With an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau and thousands of satisfied customers, Birch Gold has been the exclusive gold company of the Daily Wire for the past 7 years. So text Candace to 989898 to claim your free info kit on gold. That's Candace to 989898.
And I guess I want to ask you, because you're very interested in foreign policy, and what would be your solution to Ukraine? What's happening right now? Let's say actually the military-industrial complex doesn't get a say anymore. Dave Smith, this guy from New Jersey, gets a say.
Well, I mean, look, the obvious solution to all of this is that America is supposed to be what the founders envisioned for us. We're supposed to be a republic, a constitutional limited republic. We're not supposed to be the world empire, and we have no authority under our own constitution or under international law, as Gaddafi was pointed out, to be the empire. But this is how republics get destroyed. They become empires, and empires collapse. They're doomed to collapse. And so the obvious answer here is, look, all of these problems are just solved. I mean, again, I'm not saying that the conflict is completely solved, But the Americans' problem with it is completely solved by us just disengaging. And in fact, I think that, look, in the war in Ukraine, for example, they had a peace process worked out. They had an agreement in paper. None of this had to happen. It was early on in the war that they had this, before Boris Johnson, representing UK and America, went over there and told Zelensky, do not negotiate, and we will fund your entire war effort. Without that, he would have had no choice but to negotiate.
And now Zelensky's saying, let's negotiate. Okay, well, Putin said that like in speech one, let's negotiate, let's come to the table.
And he's probably going to get a worse deal than he would have gotten there, but they will end up negotiating. That is how they're going to end up settling this war. And all that's going to happen is that hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians died in the process for no reason. And the same thing is true with Israel. I'm not like one of these, like, there's probably some guys who I even like very much who are probably like more radical on Israel than me. I'm not like one of these river to the sea type people. Like, look, did Israel get its country by violently cleansing a whole bunch of Palestinians out of what is now Israel? Yes, that's a fact of history. That's true. Lots of nations have been formed in pretty bad situations.
Yeah. Imperialism is the story of human history.
Now, I think it's good to recognize, the healthy thing is to recognize, okay, that was wrong. That wasn't okay, but it happened. We're not giving land back. We're not giving all our homes back to the Native Americans. But what we do say is that all the Native Americans who are still here, they ought to have their rights protected just like anybody else. And that's all I'm saying Israel should do. Israel's not going anywhere. You're not returning to pre-1947 borders. That's not going to happen. 67 borders is what it's always been about in the negotiations between, in the peace process. But just imagine that if America wasn't backing up Israel, they'd have no choice but to negotiate. And for anybody out there who thinks that like this is so impossible, it can't possibly happen. Look, Israel went to war 3 times with Egypt in the first few decades of Israel's existence as a country. That was their huge enemy, was Egypt. And they made a peace for land deal in the late 70s. They've had peace with Egypt ever since.
Yeah.
This could happen. All these deals. It's in everybody's interest, you know what I mean, to work out a deal. Except when you have America, because we have so much overwhelming power that we change all the incentives. And now it's like, oh, well, I got America on my side, so I have no incentive to make a deal. So it would be what our country should be, what we should prioritize is what's best for our country. And it's very clear
That's
none of this
crazy talk.
Yes, I know. It's crazy. That's Hitler talk or something. But like, it's clearly not in our interest. We're bankrupt and we're just bleeding ourselves dry and engendering more hatred in the world. And also, it doesn't seem clear to me at all. It certainly wasn't in Ukraine's interest to have us help them. And I don't think it's in Israel's interest to have us help them in this way. I think Israel's probably more in jeopardy than it's ever been in my lifetime right now. Global opinion has totally turned against them.
And that's the danger, because it then inspires more anti-Semitism. And I think that, for me personally, looking into all of the issues there, number one, I don't want to be involved in your crap. You're saying you want to defend your borders. Cool. I want to defend my borders too. Is that so crazy? And yet they've now tried to say that people that are saying that common sense, that have that common sense perspective, are anti-Semites. I'm looking at, for me, I didn't have a horse in this race, because why would I have a horse in this race? I'm an American. But then watching this lobby, that commentary at the DC politicians essentially very quickly, turn around and go after people like Tucker Carlson, trying to smear him, who I love Tucker Carlson. I'm a Tucker Carlson stan. Everybody knows that. Smear him as an anti-Semite by saying like, hey, not our beef. How about what's happening at our own border before we send more money to defend Ukraine or Israel's border? And then I saw them turn on Charlie Kirk, a whole segment about Charlie Kirk and the rise of anti-Semitism on the right. And I was like, I worked with Charlie Kirk for 3 years. You will not find a more pro-Israel, I would almost say that this gets into the topic of dispensationalism.
Yeah, that's my criticism of Charlie Kirk.
Yeah. If you're going to criticize, like literally the number one criticism of Charlie Kirk is that he's a Zionist shill. That has been the story of Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA.
Right.
As he's raised funds, he sends kids to Israel, and they still talk about how vicious this is. Turned on him and tried to pretend that he was an anti-Semitite. Again, when
I think it's because he said,
commentary, because he asked a question. He said, I don't know if people know this. I mean, they're not allowed to do that. You're not supposed to tell people what they're not supposed to know. But there were all of these uprisings against Netanyahu. He was polling badly. And then, I think it's really weird. I've been to Israel, he said, and to tell me that there was no response, I think he said for 3 hours.
That's when he was on Patrick Bet David's show, right?
Yeah.
Well, he's just right. I think was just because this is funny too, is that it's this thing where like right after an event happens, and it was right after. It's like nobody's like, and I don't even mean like he's given marching orders. I just mean like we as social, as a social pack species, we kind of like form into like, oh, okay, these are the opinions that everyone's saying. But he's just really thinking, because it's like it just came to him, like this just happened. And he goes, hey, Israel is the fortress of the world and Gaza is the most surveilled area in the world. And you're telling me there wasn't a response for 6 hours? Like, did someone give a stand down order here? Like, what happened? Which is like a totally reasonable question to ask. Like, hey, let's figure out what happened first before we decide what we're going to do. Yes. Yeah. So I know that was it. And then he had to prove how much he does love Israel or something like that after. But I'll tell you, Tucker is also a friend of mine, and I have nothing but admiration for the guy. I mean, I think Tucker was obviously he was by far the smartest and most thoughtful person in cable news who was left. And that's why he was number one. I just think he's a totally sincere guy. That's my impression of him, who really does love his country and is quite happy to change his mind when he's wrong about stuff. And I still want to change his mind about some economic stuff that I think he gets wrong. But I think he's really does care about the country. And I'm sorry, but it's totally reasonable to have the position that, like, look, think about how insane this is, that a president somehow, like, I've read the Constitution a time or two. I'm sure you've read the Constitution.
You're not allowed to do that.
Yes, right. So you read this document to me, and you explain to me after reading this fairly clear document, you're telling me the president has the authority to bomb any country he wants to at any time for any reason, yet doesn't have the authority to protect our borders. Like, you just read me the Constitution and you explain to me what part of it you can possibly interpret as leading to that outcome. And it's just insane. Like, look, we have our government is the biggest, most powerful organization in the history of the world. It's the biggest government ever, the most powerful government ever by every measure. But technology, wealth, resources, any of this, number of people, anything. We do so many things. I mean, we spend $6 trillion a year. There's so much stuff. And yet we can't do the most basic thing that any country could do, which is just like control their own borders. That's like the number one thing of a country. That's like the first thing that you would say, like, well, what makes a nation state? And you're like, oh, well, I can draw it on a map here. These are the borders. This is the sovereign territory. And you're telling me we can't do that most basic thing, but we can remake the world in our image, and that every single time there's a conflict anywhere around the world, resources must be sent there. Yet we have these major problems here in America. And like, I'm sorry, but like, if that's an unreasonable thing to say, then this is just a goofy world. Like, I don't know. Sorry. No, you're allowed to say that. And that's actually what Tucker's demonized for saying. And no exaggeration. That's his point. So
because every country is allowed to defend its borders except for America. That turns us into xenophobes and racists, and we don't understand that we are supposed to be the pocketbook to the world. America, for all intents and purposes, at this moment, is a slave colony.
Yeah.
We work so that everybody else can have safety on their borders in the military-industrial complex.
Essentially.
We work to send money overseas.
You know what's crazy to me is I think you're a little bit younger than me. I'm 40.
I'm 34.
You're 34. Okay, so you're a little bit younger than me, and that might actually be like kind of the difference in this. Like, because I was like 18 on 9/11, right? So I was a young adult throughout the George W. Bush years. But one of the things, and for anybody, if you're like around my age, if you remember those years, one of the things that was amazing was that, and this kind of exposes somewhat of the neoconservative agenda, but that all of the George W. Bush people who totally hated Donald Trump when he came up, and partially because of what he did to Jeb Bush, and partially just because of what he stood for, but they were totally fine with using all types of like tropes about Islam up until Donald Trump, because they were using them to justify their wars. So they were, they're even through the Obama years, the whole on right-wing talk radio and on Fox News, the biggest criticism of Obama wasn't that he was accelerating George W. Bush's foreign policy and that he expanded these wars and started all these new wars as well and kept fighting the old ones. Their thing was, he's too weak. he refuses to say radical Islamic jihad. This was their big dumb criticism that all the neoconservatives had of Obama. He won't demonize these Muslims enough. It was fine to demonize them when that was leading to a mass bombing campaign in their country. But when Donald Trump came along and said, yeah, that's right, the crazy Muslims, and that's why we got to close the borders, and that's why we got to have a moratorium on Muslims coming into our country, they all went, you racist.
It's incredible.
As if it's like, it's okay to use it to, like, feel however you feel about immigration, right? There's some people I know who have different views on immigration. Maybe you think it's a horrible thing to close our borders and not let people in here who want to come in here. I don't agree with you, but maybe that's how you feel. But there's no comparing that to slaughtering them in their countries. Obviously, that's far worse, right? I remember there was this one story, it was when Trump first put in like he said Muslim ban on the campaign trail, and then he had some policy at first that I think got overruled, where like some Muslim countries couldn't come in. And there was this one Iraqi who was like detained at an airport, and they're making this big deal out of it. They were like, they were protesting outside, and MSNBC.
Suddenly we care about Iraqi civilians. I don't know.
I remember tweeting, I said, this is the nicest thing our federal government has done to an Iraqi in the last 30 years. Hold him at our airport.
Killed 1 million of your civilians,
yeah.
But here we are. We really care about that. I mean, that's a nonsense, but it's because people don't know what we do overseas.
Well, I mean, but think about this, right? The million number is really, that's from George W. Bush's war in Iraq. But that doesn't count the George H.W. Bush war in Iraq. That doesn't count the Kurds who we encouraged after that war to rise up and overthrow Saddam Hussein, and then we just bailed on them, and then Saddam Hussein slaughtered all those Kurds for rising up, which are at least partially responsible for the U.S. for telling them to do it. Then Bill Clinton had a very long sustained bombing campaign and a total blockade around the country. This was another one of Osama bin Laden's big complaints. Then you have George W. Bush. Of course, we all know that. Obama continues that war.
Obama put the bomb in Obama.
Yeah, you sure did.
That man was
Donald Trump,
bombs.
Listen, Donald Trump continued bombing campaigns in Iraq throughout his presidency, and Joe Biden just bombed him the other day. We have been bombing Iraq my entire life.
33?
I mean,
I'm
yes.
34.
Yeah, okay, so fine, your entire life, not quite my
1
entire life.
year
I had a good
on this planet.
I had a good
I was on this
6-year
planet.
run. But just think about that. I think about how there's not like, look, this is puny little Iraq. This is a third world country who has absolutely no capability of touching us. Like, how is this acceptable? That we're so much more powerful than this country. They are no threat to us whatsoever. And every single president since Ronald Reagan has gone on a bombing campaign against them. It's really just unbelievable.
I think part of it is you just can't even imagine growing up in a territory where you're just having drums bombed on you, or like routinely seeing your kids die. And I think that's part of the American privilege, is you don't even consider that. And instead you are being told that if you do consider that, you're completely crazy. And I don't know, maybe motherhood changed me, but I do think about that. I want the right to be able to say that I have an emotional, compassionate response when I consider innocent civilians who are trying to raise their kids that have dreams like my children will have dreams about what they want to do in this world, that are just being like bombed every day. And that's just supposed to be completely normal. And we're supposed to say that it's fine because it's about securing the world, when once again, we are facing this predicament, this obvious predicament that we're not even bombing our own country. And that's another thing that really bothered me when I was trying to play catch up, because we were being told that we had to care and about what was happening in Israel, and we had to support whatever they did next. And so, okay, my first thing is, let me try to get educated on this topic that you're demanding my allegiance to before I say something. And I was really bothered when a church was bombed. I am Christian. A Christian church was bombed. It was an image of a little girl being pulled from the rubble. And as a Christian, right, acknowledging that this is horrible, that there was the former congressman whose family died.
Justin Amash.
Justin Amash retweeted this, said this was sad. And in my comments, people were telling me that it was irresponsible for me to share this, that this happened, without providing it the context that this happened because Hamas uses innocent civilians as human shields. They were mad at me for not submitting to an orthodoxy, right? Of like, you're not even allowed to say that it's sad that a child is dead.
Which is
as
so-
a
and it's
Christian woman, right? Unless
Yeah.
you contextualize it so that people around the world understand that it's actually kind of fine, that who they're supposed to be mad at. No, it's a dead child. And I reserve my right to say, I had no other comment. This is sad. Of course, this
And
is
it's-
sad. Stop trying to demonize my humanity. Like, how monstrous. I don't care if it's a picture of an Israeli child. I don't care if it's a Palestinian child. This is sad. An innocent child is dead and being pulled from rubble. How dare you try to control my speech? And that has been another thing that has pissed me off about this. What you're trying to do, dress up as something else, is to control my speech. And with this little threat that if I don't say it how you want me to say it, and I don't put it in the context and with the sentence as how you want me to say it, then you're going to like call me a name that makes no sense because I said a dead child is always sad, no matter whose child it is. It's always sad to see a dead child.
Yeah, and of course, and like, I don't know. I see my kids' face in all those kids on both sides of it, and it's horrible seeing these images, especially with this war. There's been so much of it, but also just like the thing that's crazy to me is just how much the logic of this argument just falls apart. And like, it's just so, and I've heard people who like otherwise, I kind of respect and I think are smart people, some of them here on this, on this network and other people like Douglas Murray and things like that, who I think are like intelligent people.
I know Douglas very well. He is a very intelligent person.
Question. But to make the argument that, yes, it's horrible what's happening in Gaza, but it's all Hamas's fault. And there is no moral responsibility on those dropping the bombs on these buildings is just totally ridiculous. I mean, if you think about the logic of this human shield argument, right? Like, okay, there is a logic to a human shield argument. So like, I think what most of us would picture is like some guy grabs you and puts a gun to your head and then starts shooting at me and I shoot back at him and I hit you. It's totally reasonable to be like, yeah, but that's on him. I mean, he was shooting at me and I had to shoot back and whatever. But that's totally different than if a guy shoots at me and then runs into a school and then I go, all right, boys, blow up the school. And you go, hey, but there's a whole bunch of kids in there. They go, no, he's using them as human shields. So that's on him because he's in that building. I mean, that's just totally ridiculous. Now that doesn't work anymore. Yes, if they invaded Israel with kids in front of them, shooting at innocent people, and you shot back and hit the kids, okay, fine. That's on them for, you were defending yourself. But this is totally different. Like in any type of police action, which is really how these things should be handled in Gaza because it's Israel's territory. But in any type of police action, if there's a killer who's taken some people hostage and is in a school, even if he's using them as human shields, we go, all right, bring in the negotiator, talk to him, try to get some of the civilians. You don't just blow up innocent civilians. Look, to me, and I find this over and over again, the only way, like the people who are supporting this war and the people who are just like completely pro-Israel in this situation, the underlying thing that you always find in their arguments is that they just don't value Palestinian life as much as they value Israeli life. And that's okay. I mean, you can have that position, but that it's just not a reasonable way to actually deal with this conflict. And you can't expect the Palestinians then to not have the same attitude.
I went through a firestorm for saying, after watching Brian Mast give a speech in Congress and say there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian. That is genocidal language.
Yeah.
That is that is crazy to say about any. No such thing as an Iraqi. Give me the worst country that you can imagine. Of course, there are innocent civilians. I mean, I guess the American conscience always goes, World War II, okay, Adolf Hitler. Were there innocent German civilians? Of course, yeah. Of course. Dresden is a good place to start, like what we did there was pretty crazy.
Many of them were more direct victims of Hitler than others.
It's an absurdity to say, you know what I mean? Absurdity to say there's no such thing, and you're talking about an entire group of people, of an innocent civilian. And I was livid about this. I tweeted that genocide, no matter who, it's coming, the language it's coming from, is always wrong. Talking about Brian Mast and Firestorm. They were like, no, you cannot say this. This is what notoriously led to David Horowitz of the Freedom Center writing a piece saying, goodbye, Candace Owens, which was one of the worst smear pieces I've ever read. Goodbye, David Horowitz, to you too, because how dare you? Yeah. How dare you lie to your audiences, claim that I said this about Israel when I was talking about Brian Mast. You just put words in my mouth, A, and then B, to try to justify what you're doing, which is such a nasty, underhanded, backstabbing tactic, then say, Candace Owens had Andrew Tate on her podcast. That was back in June before October 7th. We didn't talk about Israel-Palestine
Right.
at all. We talked about men, women, like, which I'm very interested in. And then you say, here's what Andrew Tate said about Israel-Palestine. That was what the whole article was. Like, so basically, I'm guilty for having Andrew Tate, just because you're mad, because you assumed, which is interesting, by the way, that you assumed I was talking about Israel, when you can clearly see leading up to this tweet, I'm just liking Yashar Ali was a journalist, and he was like, and he's actually pro-Israel, I think, as I take him. And he was like, can we all just say that this is wrong? Like, what Brian Mast is doing here is wrong. And I was like, this is crazy. It's genocidal. And it's happening in an American Congress. What do you, like, we should all always be able to say that genocide is wrong. Like, I hope that's okay. I feel good. I think the tweet will age well,
Right.
And yeah, it was, that's crazy. There is a group of people that believe that, and Brian Mast, I would say, is one of them, that there's no such thing as an innocent Palestinian, and that language is genocidal.
It's funny because that's the same thing whenever like the hit pieces are written about me, and I haven't gotten as many as you yet. I'm working on it though. But whenever, it's unbelievable. But so whenever like these hit pieces, like the Southern Poverty Law Center and the New Republic, and I've got, I'm getting some hit pieces written. I'm trying to step it up. But they always go to just who I've interviewed. It's always, he had a conversation with Nick Fuentes once, and once he had a conversation with Richard Spencer, and once he did this, and you're kind of like, I just love it too, especially when it's coming from guys like Horowitz. It's like, dude, you were friends with John McCain. Get the hell out of here. The people you talk to are so much worse than the people I talk to.
Yeah.
Why am I supposed to pretend that like, I don't know. I don't know that much about Andrew Tate. I've seen like some clips of his that I really loved. And like he was saying some great stuff and saying it in like a great way. Like if he's on your side of an argument, he's like a guy you want arguing your point. Like he's very good at it. I also really don't like all of the pimp stuff that I've like heard from him. Like I'm a family guy, like I'm a family man. I don't like that stuff. But regardless, it's like, I don't know. Even if the worst things that he's accused of were true, he's still not nearly as guilty as these politicians who lie us into war, And like, I just hate the idea that any of them like look down at us for asking very reasonable questions and then having conversations with people.
He's the 8th most Googled person in the world behind Jeff Bezos. Is it that crazy that journalists are wondering how did he get so famous?
Yeah.
He has a large audience. Is it crazy that I wanted to sit down and talk with him? And no, obviously this is normal. They didn't say the same thing about every other person. The BBC sat down with him. Piers Morgan sat down with him. But again, this is the standard. This is this is why I say it's an underhanded trick, because you're somehow going, well, Candace did it and it's different. Yeah, so did every other journalist who wanted to sit down and talk to him, because he's gotten so famous by himself and outside of, the mainstream media orbit. That's interesting. I'm an interested person. Do I agree with everything Andrew Tate has done and said? Obviously not, right? There are things that I've said before that I don't agree with when I was a liberal, and you know what I'm saying? So it's like, do we have the ability to change? It's another question. Can we evolve in our opinions? That's why I love Tucker Carlson so much. Because he's like, I don't agree with what I said about the Iraq War. I was wrong then. Yeah, you're allowed to evolve. You're allowed to be a human. And I thought that piece that he wrote about me was just, I hope people go and read it. I hope it becomes the most famous piece ever read about me, because you will really understand how underhanded it is when you don't tell people that you're just blaming me for everything Andrew Tate said, not in my presence, that I had nothing to do with,
I would also just, I would just let people know that this is, it's a part of a much bigger history and a much bigger story, like specifically what's that piece being written about you. I would really encourage people, if they've never read it, there's this really great book called The Betrayal of the American Right by Murray Rothbard. And he goes through kind of like the whole history of the right wing in America, and then how the neoconservatives kind of took it over and hijacked the whole thing, and how like National Review type conservatives became that, basically it's the transition from the old right into what he calls the new right, which we might call the old right now, because now there's kind of a whole new right. But there it is. And he talks about how the right wing was transformed from being a non-interventionist wing. Like the conservative wing of the Republican parties were the ones who didn't want to get involved in the world wars, and then they were transformed into being the Cold Warriors who wanted to get into every single intervention. And he kind of talks about how all of these kind of like very reasonable, wise voices within the right wing were totally demonized. And they would like viciously attack them and make them out to be like, you think about like people like Pat Buchanan, who was viciously demonized as like a Jew hater because he one time said that nobody wants war in Iraq except for weapons companies and the Israeli lobby.
And
that was enough to be like, you hate Jewish people, even though the statement is so objectively correct. But there were so many people like this who got totally like driven out of respectable, conservatism Inc.
Is this why when you were on Tucker, you were talking about William F. Buckley?
Yes.
And Tucker said this statement, I view him to be one of the great
No,
villains.
I said it, and then he agreed.
Okay.
I said it, and then he went, I totally agree, and did his Tucker Carlson laugh, which is, just like this,
Great laugh.
this grenade, you never quite know when it's going to come, but I do find it very endearing. I know
It
some
is
people
endearing.
don't like it.
It's so endearing.
Because it's real. You can't fake that. But yeah, so he agreed. But yeah, this was a major part of it. It was a major part of it.
Yeah, can you explain? Because I don't really know enough about William F. Buckley, so it was obviously a very quick exchange between you and Tucker. So I'd love to hear you sort of explicate.
Okay, so William F. Buckley, he was he worked at the CIA for a while.
Okay.
Then they'll claim he left, but I don't know. I have my suspicions. But he was the editor for National Review, and he was the host of Firing Line. And this was like the biggest conservative publication and the most popular conservative
What year was
TV
this, by
show.
the way? Skylar, if you can pull it, throw it on the screen. William F. Buckley leaving the CIA. If you can find that.
It's post World War II. I'd have to check what year they actually started, but I know that like it was huge throughout like the 60s and 70s.
Okay.
But it may have been earlier than that the publication was founded. But he had this great piece which actually kind of laid out the entire position of what became the new right in the second half of the 20th century. I'm blanking on the name of his piece. I remember the piece that Rothbard wrote in response to it, where it was called Buckley Revealed or something like that. But if you want to find the piece, you could just Google William F. Buckley, totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores, because that was the line that he has. Basically, the piece that he writes is he kind of starts it by essentially saying that libertarians are right. That he's like, look, we all agree as conservatives. We know that the biggest struggle in human history is that between tyranny and liberty, and that the state is an instrument of tyranny, and that's why we oppose big government. And then he goes, but see, here's the thing. There's this Soviet Union, and they're hell-bent on world domination, and they represent total statism. And so the only way to fight them off is for us to have a big government here in order to have a military that can take on the Soviet Union. And he literally argues, his words are, we will need, for the duration of the Soviet Union existing, a totalitarian bureaucracy within our shores. To fight from a totalitarian bureaucracy taking over, we must create one ourselves, was the logic of it. And then, of course, by the way, when the Soviet Union collapsed, nobody went, oh, okay, well, now we don't need the military-industrial complex anymore. We were just like, hey, no, let's go fight a war in Iraq. So, right. But anyway, so then his whole, basically what he did was drum out any anti-war voice on the right wing, which had been rich with a tradition of anti-war voices, going back all the way to the Founding Fathers. And that was really his mission. And he would drum them out the same way every single time, calling them racist. It was always the way he did it. Playing into this kind of left, almost pre-woke era game where the John Birchers were racist and Sam Francis was racist, and then later Pat Buchanan was racist. And the way the game works is essentially that Ron Paul was racist. The way it works is that you find any questionable statement that anyone's made. If they're anti-war, then you just talk about that all the time. So in the same way, if you remember, I don't know how much you followed when Ron Paul was running for president, but every time CNN was talking about Ron Paul, they would bring up what were known as the Ron Paul newsletters. Because in the 80s and 90s, Ron Paul had these newsletter that other people wrote in. There was just a whole lot of, his name was on it, but a lot of people wrote articles in it. And some people, not him, but other people wrote some racially insensitive things in the 90s. So decades before when he was running for president, other people wrote in a news, right. Now, every time he gets on CNN, they go, now what about these newsletters that were racist? Do you denounce that? Now, Joe Biden, as you know, has said some like crazy racially insensitive remarks over the years. But that never gets brought up when Joe Biden comes on. So this is what they would do. Every conservative who was a war hawk, didn't matter what they had said. But every conservative who was against interventionism, they'd bring up the 5 insensitive things they said and then twist them in the worst way. So that's why I think I think Tucker Carlson agreed that William F. Buckley was such a negative force. And this is Ben Shapiro did take issue with this. And he said, well, I don't understand what your beef could be. I mean, this guy was like the most influential conservative figure, and he was fighting for like social conservative values and all this. And, it's like, oh, okay. Well, how'd that work out? Like as the leader of this movement, what exactly did he conserve? We're arguing over what a woman is now.
Mm-hmm.
As maybe
also just fighting for a totalitarian regime in our shores.
Right.
That's crazy.
When we say something is free, it should mean precisely that, free. No strings attached, no hidden cost, and no fine print to decipher. When you switch to Pure Talk today, you'll get a free Samsung 5G smartphone. There is no 4-line requirement and no activation fee, just a free Samsung built to last with a rugged screen, quick charging battery, and top-tier data security. Qualifying plans start at just $35 a month for unlimited talk, text, 15 gigs of data, and a mobile hotspot. Pure Talk gives you the phenomenal coverage of America's most dependable 5G network. It's the same coverage you know and love, but for half the price of the other guys. The average family saves almost $1,000 a year. Plus, with Pure Talk, you know you're spending your hard-earned money with a company that aligns with your values. Let Pure Talk's expert U.S. customer service team help you make the switch today. Go to puretalk.com/Owens to claim your eligibility for your free brand new Samsung 5G smartphone and start saving on wireless today. Again, go to puretalk.com/Owens to switch to my cell phone company today.
And it also did always seem like, those, like the neoconservatives always did talk a game about how they cared about social conservatism. But it always seemed like they cared about their wars a lot more than that.
They will violate every single rule of Americanism. I do have to say this because this is something that really frustrated me and made me so angry. And it was really a difficult time for me because I had to explain, my husband's from the UK, they don't have free speech in the UK. Right. So sometimes when you're even trying to translate what you're saying as an American, the UK doesn't understand. They're like, why wouldn't Candace support this? Because, I have tons of Jewish friends in the UK as well. And they didn't understand that the reason why AIPAC is suddenly being looked at, the reason why conservatives are suddenly going, okay, what the heck is this? Is because enshrined in our Constitution is freedom of speech. And suddenly, the neocon class basically started saying, like, no more free speech because we want, we don't want people saying or questioning anything that's happening in Israel. This is what made me go, okay, I don't like this guy, Bibi Netanyahu. I had nothing to say about it before. You're demanding we take a look at this person. And an old clip started circulating of him talking about how he was getting laws passed in America. It's not that old, by the way. The clip is from 2020, and it was shared on the Israeli Twitter feed. Like, this was like they were proud of this. This is the actual Twitter website. This is X, formerly Twitter. Obviously, the Prime Minister of Israel. They tweeted this on February 12, 2020, when I wasn't paying attention to anything that was going on in Israel, because why would I have been paying attention to anything that was going on in Israel? This is them saying, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, whoever boycotts us will be boycotted. The UN Human Rights Council is a biased body that is devoid of influence. Not for nothing have I already ordered the severing of ties with it. It was also not for nothing that the American administration has taken this step together with us. In recent years, we have promoted laws in most U.S. states which determine that strong action is to be taken against whoever tries to boycott Israel. Therefore, this body is unimportant. Instead of the organization dealing with human rights, it only tries to disparage Israel. We strongly reject this contemptible effort. And then in the video, he says, don't worry, I'm paraphrasing here. Don't worry about America. We have worked with American people. We've got laws passed. And essentially, whoever boycotts Israel will be made to suffer for boycotting Israel. And then these laws, I looked up, and yes, laws have been passed, right? In America, and I hope this makes sense to people that are watching this overseas, This is a conflict with the American right to free speech. You have a right in America, as long as you're not doing anything to harm people violently, you can say things that we fundamentally disagree with. And then all of a sudden, the commentariat started insisting that, students go on blacklists for having the wrong ideas. Absolutely insane. And that, to me, I was like, you know what? I don't know much about this guy. I've met him in the past when Trump was in office, and I didn't care to explore more into Bibi Netanyahu because, again, it's not my country. But this is my country.
Yeah.
Okay. So to the extent that you are going, don't worry about America. We have them on lock, and if any person who boycotts Israel will effectively have their life ruined, that's crazy. You have a right to boycott.
Listen,
you have a right to free speech. You have a right to protest. That is what we hold as Americans, who are conserving the Constitution, and that I do not like at all.
Yeah. Well, okay. So a couple things on that, because it really is amazing. But think about it like this, right? In America, over the last decade, we've seen many efforts to boycott states within America from progressives who didn't like their abortion laws, or like all these things where Beyonce won't work and do concerts in this state anymore, something like that. And that's totally fine. We can boycott our own states, but you can't boycott a foreign government, or there will be all these laws that they've put into effect in different states. You can't get a government job, or you can't, you know what I mean?
They were talking full corporate blacklist.
Well, this is right, corporate blacklist, and then, as you said, these kind of blacklists of college students.
That's speech.
But
That's literally speech.
But you can say anything you want about our country. You can trash our country. You can boycott our country. But you can't boycott Israel. So first, just think about that. But then also, I really do think this is something that's really important for people to understand about this current war that's going on, is that, people will say, like, okay, like, look, what Hamas did on October 7th was like horrible and unacceptable. And like, of course, that's totally reasonable. Yeah. But it's also worth pointing out that this was the peaceful attempt. The movement to boycott Israel over its treatment of the Palestinians, this was the attempt to do it peaceful. Like, this is literally what, even in our public schools, they celebrate about the civil rights movement, is that it's like, yeah, these massive boycott campaigns.
Well, I call for a boycott, just to give an example of why this matters, what you're saying. Like, you're right, you're allowed to do this. Like, I say, don't shop at Target.
Yeah.
I don't like what they're saying. I don't like what they're selling, this whole trans ideology. We show this on my show. I say, boycott it. Why would that not be okay for an individual to decide that they don't want to spend their money at Target? So I'm really trying to understand.
And it's effective and it works, and it's the civilized
Matt Walsh
way
called
to do
for the boycott of Budweiser when they did it was extremely effective,
Oh, they turned it all around. That woman got fired, and now they're sponsoring Sean Strickland or whatever.
That's what we do in a peaceful manner to say, I don't agree with this.
Yes, it's the civilized market-based response to something you don't like. Is that, hey, I'm not telling everybody to go in there and start beating Target employees up with a club to their head, but I'm saying, hey, if they're going to have this weird stuff and it's going to be near the kids section, then I'm not going to Target anymore. I don't think you should either.
If you're a lib and you love Target, you can say, I'm going to double my spending here because I think you're stupid and you're transphobic, so I'm going to double my spending here.
But there's and
you
look,
vote with how you spend is what we say.
And so, but this was the global effort to have a peaceful response to Israel. It's like, hey, they're not advocating terrorism. They're not like saying blow up innocent people or something, but we're saying, hey, we're going to boycott you until you stop treating these people this way. And largely, Israel's issue with it was just that you're shining a spotlight on how they're treating, because the truth is a lot of people, particularly in America, just don't know about that at all. And I know I've talked to a lot of people like that who basically the story they hear is like, well, Israel's just like living there, and then these people keep shooting rockets at them, and like, why would they do that? And Israel has a right to exist in there. And a lot of people think they're two different, like they think Palestinians already have a state. Because just like when you say like, oh, Israel's at war with Gaza, immediately what most people think of is like, there must be two governments who are at war here because everyone has a government. So like, why wouldn't they? But anyway, regardless of that, when there are these peaceful attempts to be made, they're met with violence. State-sanctioned violence in this case. Like, we're passing laws against you. We're going to try to ruin your life for like peacefully protesting Israel's treatment of the Palestinians. And in 2018, they had a big series of protests in Gaza, and they opened machine gun fire on the protests. I think Norman Finkelstein was talking about this. It might have been here on your show. But so it's not like, And again, that's not justifying October 7th, but it's like you can't respond violently to every peaceful, response and then be shocked when there's a violent one.
Yeah, and so I think it got misconstrued that, when conservatives in America were saying we're not comfortable with this, we're not comfortable, especially when they started turning the figurative guns on college students. I was a living college. How could I not defend this? That is what we hope college is for. We don't want them to be totalitarian campuses for ideas, which they kind of are, left-leaning ideas. But at the end of the day, if you're wrong, I want to debate you. If you say people boycott me, I want people watching her show. I don't want this because she doesn't agree with the BLM thing. I have never, ever, as a conservative American, would I ever dream of saying, put these students on blacklists?
Yeah.
And when that started being that talking point that followed, that these kids should go on blacklists, and they were making it seem like we were crazy for saying, no, let's go show them the truth. That's a future Thomas Sowell. That could be a future Milton Friedman. That could be a future Candace Owens. I did the work. I went onto these college campuses when Black Lives Matter was actually effectively terrorizing America all across the world. And I debated these people, and they boycotted. They told people not to buy tickets. That was a form of, divestment from conservative principles or ideas. They were playing Beyonce music outside when me and Charlie Kirk were trying to speech. So I did that. So this is what I principally believe, right? Even before we even talk about the topic of Israel, I principally believe that we need more speech, not less, right?
Right.
Because I believe so much in what I am saying to be true that I can convince you to stop thinking this way. This is what I principally believe about transgenderism. It is absolute rot. But I don't want those kids who don't have the right ideas about transgenderism because their professors are promoting a certain thing. I want them to hear the truth. I want to invite them to hear the truth. I want to be on their college campuses.
Yeah, so many of them have never heard it before.
They've never heard it.
They haven't even had the opportunity.
Yeah.
For this. And, I'll say also...
So why put them on blacklists?
It's totally insane. And it's totally hypocritical for all these people who were like against wokeism on college campus. And then as soon as it comes to the topic of Israel, it's like they're the wokest people amongst any of us. Like, you're an anti-Semite for questioning this.
Yeah, speech is dangerous now.
The blurring of lines between threats of violence and speech are all... And look, this is one more level to this that I'll say. And like, listen, I'm Jewish and you're Black, but I see people like Nikki Haley and DeSantis, and I know like both saying like DeSantis actually taking steps in Florida to like welcome Jewish students there or like ban this criticism of Israel. And Nikki Haley said, as long as this anti-Semitism keeps up as president, I'm gonna defund all of these universities that have anti-Semitic things there. And it's like, hey, like, what about white people? Like, why? It's like, first of all, Jews are 2% of the United States of America. The majority of them are liberal. I don't know how much of your voting base is Jewish. I guess DeSantis has a fair amount there down in Florida. But like, you got a lot of white people who vote for you. And they have been so viciously demonized in college campuses across the country for the last decade, let's say probably a little before that, but really the last decade in an insane way. I mean, insane. Like the stories that come out of there are like, no exaggeration. I've talked to college kids who like, I know there's one kid who wanted to be a writer, and he was just in like a creative writing class. And they would go around the room and pick apart his writing and say like, oh, I don't think you should be able to write about he wrote like maybe there was like a violent scene or something like that. And he's like, as a white man, you really shouldn't be allowed to write about violence. And this is like just normal stuff.
This is worse.
Yeah.
Drexel University, a professor tweeted out, "All I want for Christmas is a white genocide."
Yeah. I mean,
fine. Didn't lose his job. Was defended because BLM rhetoric had gotten so crazy. Professors were calling for a white genocide on campus. Nobody cared.
And this is also, again, like on the theme we were talking about before, this is how you get more white identitarianism. I mean, this is how you get, if like nobody else will stand up for them, and they're the only group that's like allowed to be viciously attacked, like
I could say whatever
rhetorically
I want about white people, and it would be promoted on YouTube.
And it's just like, I mean, and it's something to see these Republicans like, it's like, yeah. You're just taking a position that's kind of easy to take right now. But like, how about you have the courageous position of actually saying like, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have like demonizing language toward any racial group on college campuses. But if you were gonna start somewhere, and then on top of that, it's not just that like white men, or I guess more specifically like straight white men, but it's not just that that's the only group that you're totally allowed to be viciously racist toward, but it's also like backed up by actual discriminatory practices. And it's also backed up by like, you've got to accept that like, hey, we live in this new DEI world where we are going to stack the deck against you at every job you're ever applying for, at every position you ever want to get. We're going to be going out of our way. We want to see more female people of color in these positions and less of you in them. And I mean, like, what? And this is like the total thing why Republicans,
which, by the
are such
way,
failures.
is like divesting in white people.
Essentially, right?
That was a corporate policy. Like, you know, like we need to just sort of say that we need to, every position needs to look black. It needs to be this. This is what we want the boardroom to look like, how many, whether it's women, whatever it is, you know, also attacks on men in general,
Sure.
particularly men, right? To be a white, straight male is really the crime of the century. And so people are noticing, like, why didn't you defend people in this country when they were subjected to this for years?
And isn't that really the essence of why they all love Donald Trump so much and none of them are supporting Nikki Haley? It's really just like the essence of yeah, because they believe, whether rightly or wrongly, that he's sticking up for them. And it's like, you're not. You're just clearly not. You're not really sticking up for your constituency. And like, so why should they not support the guy who at least they think is? And I don't know if it's exactly right. Like, I get frustrated and disappointed in Donald Trump a lot, but I do totally get like seeing like DeSantis and Nikki Haley have this response to, like, you know, again, a lot of these college kids, like they're young.
And they're stupid.
And they're stupid, and they've bought into this leftist woke
Some
world.
of them are just signing letters, by the way, because they're like getting extra 10%. Some of them are high, trying to get a date with a girl that's at the protest. I'm like,
they're just doing the thing.
Remembers being at a college campus, like the reasons you would get behind something that you don't know anything about.
And I will say, as somebody who's like a very sharp critic of Israel, there has been stuff out of some of the protests where you're like, geez, guys, like,
right.
You know,
and we should enforce laws. Whenever it trips over into violence, that's the point. Why I don't like race-specific laws is because we already have acknowledged that you cannot do these things. It's already illegal.
Well, yeah, I mean, and the stuff where, like, if you're blocking the road and stuff, like, you might as well work for Mossad.
I hate you.
You literally, like, you might as well be
when the Palestinian
Israeli
protesters blocked the road to the airport, I was just like, there's got to be a law on the books for this because it's impacting so many people's lives.
Yeah, you can't just do this. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry.
Like,
this is not acceptable.
Yeah, exactly. And you're almost like, you're making me want to root for Israel. So like, this is the
worst thing you could do is block our path to JFK. Just so you know, every single person will be pro-Israel if you keep this up.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's already a disaster and we need to get there.
And there's weird, you know, I've seen people chanting stuff like, you know, the freedom fighters on hang gliders type thing. And you're like, yeah, guys, geez.
I mean, the freaking BLM putting the paraglider on their Twitter or whatever. Wow, how disgusting.
Yeah, it's horrible.
You are absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, it's like, come on. And it's the stupidest, most least effective way. You know, it's just like the other tragedy of Black Lives Matter is just that you're like, well, look, there are problems with law enforcement and there are things that we should look at and there are people who are victims of police brutality. But man, you're just turning anyone off to even wanting to have a conversation about this. It's
classic like, BLM. Like,
is it so?
No matter
you
what.
know, you read on the official organization, like when I can't remember. It's been years since I've read this, but it's almost like when you read like their list of demands or whatever, and it starts off where it's like accountability for killer cops, and you're kind of like, all right, okay, I'm with you so far. Then it's like da-da-da. And then it's like abolish the nuclear family. Like, wait, what? How did we get here? How did we get to here? It's like, listen, I've this is totally reasonable, you know, like if a cop beats up an innocent person, they should go to jail for that. And you're like, I'm with you. You just go, okay, no more moms and dads. And you're like, I'm sorry, can we go over that last one that you just threw at me right there? Wait, so I have to sign up for that one too to be on board with the first part? Like that seems like you might lose some people. So it's like they're totally the least effective advocates for but like, again, that also isn't really what matters. What matters isn't really what dumb college kids are saying about an issue. What matters is like, okay, what's really going on in this war? Who's really being, you know, aggressed upon? And what is America's role in all of this? And why is there an American role in it to begin with?
Right.
And those are the questions that really matter.
And I hope asking those questions, and I have a ton of Jewish people that listen to this podcast, and like I said, like my heart with my Jewish friends in New York who just could not comprehend what was going on. The people they're hearing from the media that the Holocaust is coming back, like they're genuinely scared. Like it's not, and that is how you would feel when you're starting to hear that sort of commentary over and over. So I hope that just to the Jewish people listening to this, that the takeaway here is that first off, you have a right to think outside of your identity. Secondly, do not believe this magic trick, this hat trick that the people that have been your allies, dated your men, had a mezuzah on their wall, suddenly one day woke up and chose to be like that should make you go instantly, what's actually going on here? And I hope that now that you hear this more nuanced take where it's like, yes, people have said and done horrific things. I also hated the pulling down of the posters of Israeli children. Leave the kids alone on both sides, please.
It's
Can
just
we
like, what
feel
exactly?
sad? What are you accomplishing here?
Yeah.
Dude, it's a dead Israeli child, a missing Israeli child, whatever it is. We don't know where they're coming. Okay, I don't care what your excuse is. Just stop when it comes to innocent children being killed. I am going to have an emotional response to that. You're an a-hole for pulling this down
And isn't
thinking
your
that it's
whole-
going to bring me to your side, especially when your whole bit is
The
innocent.
kids are being killed, so it's like,
Yes.
just think about how you're coming off here now. Whether and I get the response that's like, look, there's also a propagandistic element to putting the missing pictures up because
That's what
it's
their
not,
argument is.
It's
But
not like
is
they're
it bothering
in this
you?
area,
Is
but
it bothering
still
you?
okay. But what are you doing by tearing it down? It's like, yeah, this isn't gonna help at all,
And you know what? If life is propaganda. If they're putting it up because they're trying to get people to keep thinking about this issue that means a lot to them, then okay.
Put up posters
Put up
of the
posters of
Palestinian
Palestinian
kids.
of kids as well, because like I just said, it's effective.
Right.
As a woman, when I see a dead Israeli child, I feel something because I should.
Yeah.
Don't problematize that. I feel something when I see a dead Palestinian child because I should, and I won't allow you to problematize that. But yeah, I hope. Anyways, just the takeaway of this is just the nuance, which is I, as an American, have questions about what is happening here. I am always going to defend America first. I don't want us spending money overseas when our borders are not protected. And I demand a logical explanation, not an emotional one, for why we need to be continually involved in these overseas wars, why we can't even get paved roads and like a fair price on chicken, and gasoline. And that's it. That's all that's been said here by the majority of people who are now being castigated for asking very simple questions. What would you want the takeaway for people that are listening to this? Because I think it's some conversation. I would listen to this podcast. What do you
Me
want the
too.
takeaway to be?
Well, I mean, look, the bottom line is that all that stuff about the advice of all of the founding fathers about not getting in entangling alliances and not searching the world for monsters to destroy, these were very wise people. It's not a coincidence that they founded the most powerful nation that's ever been created. And look, what's happening here is we're all watching this happen. We're in the middle of a dying empire. And that doesn't mean it's impossible to like abandon the empire and revive the republic. But those are the choices. There's no third option. You can either abandon the empire or you can go down with the ship. And all of these things are very connected. All of the inflation, you're talking about like a fair price on chicken and all of this. It's like, but we've gotten to the point where we can't tax enough to pay for the level of government spending, and we can't borrow enough. And so we have to print the money for it. And that's what's creating the inflation. It's very easy to say. I mean, the lefties can blame corporate greed all they want to, but you can just go look at a chart of how much money was printed in 2020 and 2021, and then look at the price inflation that followed it from them. It's very simple supply and demand. You make more dollars, they're worth less. And everything that is being done to you, like the reason why our country is collapsing is because of how out of control our government is. And that's really the only answer. And look, like I got kids, you have kids. Our kids are going to grow up in this country. That has to be our number one priority, like bigger than any other priority anything else we've ever cared about. What kind of country are our kids going to have to grow up in? And I think for everybody listening, that should be your priority too. And the way we get there is to have somewhat of a return to what made this country so great to begin with, which was that we created a place where there was a large degree of freedom for the citizens who lived there. And that's the only way this happens. And I'm very optimistic that this can happen. We're living in a brave new world. I don't mean that in the Huxley sense. I just mean it's crazy. We've never been in anything like this before. They've lost control of the propaganda. It's the only time ever. They don't have a monopoly on this anymore. The biggest influential people are like Joe Rogan and Tucker Carlson. And then there's so many shows like your show. There's so many shows with tons of people listening to it. And they're getting all this new information now. And we have a real shot to kind of break out of this and kind of take back our culture, take back our country, and actually make this a great place for kids to grow up. But the way you have to do that is you have to stop debasing the currency. You have to stop extracting so much wealth from the American people and have it spent by a corrupt, centralized federal government. And you got to stop fighting wars all over the world and coming up and just stop believing these BS justifications. Even like Bobby Kennedy was saying to me the other day, is comparing Hamas to the Nazis. And I'm like, the Nazis ruled from France to Poland. And then we're going after England and Russia. They were trying to conquer all of Europe. Hamas doesn't even have Gaza. What are we talking about here? The idea that Vladimir Putin is any type of threat. None of these things are threats to us. They're all completely made up. So all you have to do is the next time anyone's trying to scare you about some threat, just assess whether it's really a threat to the United States of America or not. And if it's not, then we don't support fighting wars. It's like crazy. This is like literally, can we get a 5-year break? Can we go 5 years without a war? How about 1? Can we do a year? How about 6 months?
Crazy.
6
what
month
if we
challenge.
didn't drop a bomb for 6 months?
For 6 months. And okay, if we're attacked, then we go destroy whoever attacked us. But short of that, let's take a break. And we'll give America a 6-month chip at the end of 6 months with no war. We'll be like, here, 6 months with no war. Really proud of you. We'll have a party and everything. Maybe we'll fall off the wagon. You start over again, but whatever. That's my takeaway for people who all this.
That's so great. And this is what we need. We need a rehab for these people.
Yeah.
And they just every day say, I didn't drop a bomb, And we get the McCains, the Bushes, the Clintons, the Obamas in there.
Hi, I'm George W. Bush, and I'm a war hawk. Hi, George. He goes, well, it was another day. Really wanted a war today, but I didn't.
Hi,
Anyway.
I'm Meghan McCain, the daughter of Warhawk, and I didn't tweet anything about why we should be jumping into another war today.
Just good job, Megan. Good job. It's hard. It's hard sometimes. I know you want to.
Hello, my name is Lindsey Graham.
She goes, all right, so Lindsey Graham, when you feel like starting a war, what's something else you can do? And says, go for a walk. Yeah, you could go for a walk instead of fighting a war. That's a good thing. What else? Can you eat a sandwich? Okay, all right. That's another thing you could do. Let's just think of other things we could do when we feel like doing a war.
But I want to bomb Iran. No, Lindsey.
Listen, that's
Lindsey,
normal.
Sit down.
That's normal. Of course you do. But how about you knit something, Lindsey? That's something cool. And now you have a sock. That's the solution. Rehab for warhawks.
The takeaway is that Lindsey Graham needs a sock to knit, guys. Dave, you are hilarious. You're brilliant. I am so endeared by this conversation, and I think this is the greatest conversation I've ever had in the podcast. And part of it was because I'm learning from you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Putting me down different holes, and I hope that's why people like listening to me, is because I don't know everything, but I'm interested. That's what I always say. I'm interested, and I will always be honest with people. And if I get something wrong, I will go back and I will correct it. But I really want to encourage people to follow you. So can you tell them where they can follow you, where they can see you? You're also a comic, which we just saw this at the end because that was very funny.
Right. Yes, I get very serious on these podcasts, but I'm a funny stand-up comedian. And comicdavesmith.com, all my tour dates are there. And it's Comic Dave Smith on Twitter and The Problem Dave Smith on Instagram. I just want to say thank you very much for the kind words, and thank you for having me. And the reason I was really excited when you invited me on, I really wanted to come down here to do this just because I've really been impressed by you, particularly just like the way you've handled things since the war in Gaza broke out. And I know kind of it is a little bit of an awkward situation in some dynamics here.
At the very least.
To have this position, but I think that you've shown like real courage and integrity through that. So I was real happy to come on, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, you guys. Thanks for joining us. I know that you enjoyed this conversation, so definitely let us know your comments via your comments, what your thoughts are. And don't forget, if you are watching this, how dare you not subscribe to this channel right now? I just gave you magic and a Lindsey Graham sock. We'll see you guys next time.